Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past the marble columns and gold-threaded veils of history to meet the women whose power didn't come from a crown or a battlefield, but from charm, intelligence, and a mastery of the human psyche. These are the courtesans, and if you think that's just a fancy word for woman on the sidelines, you're about to find out how dangerously wrong that is, because tonight you're not just watching the story, you are the story. You step into silken shoes, drink bold wine with philosophers, and wield whispers like daggers. You probably won't survive this, not politically at least, because ancient empires are fragile and you, my friend, are about to rattle a few thrones just by breathing the wrong way near a king. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from, what city and what time is it for you? Midnight in Boston, 3 AM in Manila? I want to know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in Athens sometime in the 4th century BCE, where the air smells like roasted lamb, olive oil, and something else, maybe ambition. You're Phryne. That's not your birth name, of course, your real name doesn't matter. Phryne means toad, a mocking nickname you've spun into a persona. You're not just a courtesan, you're the most expensive, most sought-after woman in Greece. And today you're on trial for impiety. Yeah, impiety. As in insulting the gods, specifically Aphrodite, which is ironic because your entire life has basically been an offering to her. Let's rewind. You weren't always draped in saffron silks and winking at generals. You were born in Thespiae, a town with very little going for it except its reputation for producing beautiful women. You learned early how to walk slowly, how to turn your face into poetry. You moved to Athens and not to blend in, but to dominate. And you did. Sculptors used your body as the model for Aphrodite herself. That's right, the statue that men travel across the sea to worship. It's you, or at least your hips. But with fame comes enemies. A group of men, politicians mostly, brittle with power, accuse you of blasphemy. They say your beauty has become a kind of religious offence, that you've corrupted rituals with your presence. The real offence? That you're a woman with too much attention, too much autonomy, and you charge for it. So here you are, standing in the agora under the beating sun, hundreds of citizens forming a half-moon around the speaker's platform. Your lawyer is Hyperides, a silver-tongued orator who also happens to be your lover. Or at least he was. You've never made a habit of loyalty. There's no coin in that. The trial is going badly. The men on the jury want to punish you for being what they can't control. Hyperides sees it. He panics. And then, he does something no one expects. He tears your robe open. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Your skin catches the sunlight like marble. You don't flinch, you just breathe. Behold, Hyperides shouts, the living image of Aphrodite herself. It's a gamble, an act of both desperation and genius. You didn't plan it, but you understand the game instantly. The courtroom isn't a place of logic, it's theatre. And now the jurors are transfixed. This isn't just flesh, this is divine proof. If you're Aphrodite's mirror, how can you blaspheme her? They acquit you. That's the moment your legend shifts from whispered fame to eternal myth. You go from high-priced companion to cultural symbol. You don't just entertain men now, you own them. Philosophers argue about your mind as much as your body. Artists immortalize your pose. Coins pass hand to hand with your face stamped on them. But here's the fun part. Your power doesn't come from being submissive. You mock those who try to own you. You charge obscene amounts for a single night and then use the money to fund temples. You stroll into religious festivals and bathe nude in front of thousands. Not for attention, but because you can. One time, at a symposium full of old men and new money, a wealthy client asks if he can keep you. You laugh in his face, Adams. I'm not a statue, you say. I move where I please. He tries to buy your loyalty with gold. You thank him, take the coin, and sleep with his rival. They say you die rich, eccentric, and utterly unrepentant. But some believe you vanish, that you walk into the sea one evening, dissolve into salt and memory. After all, Aphrodite was born from sea foam. Why shouldn't you return to it? Here's a fun twist. Scholars still debate whether your trial really happened, or whether Hyperides ever disrobed you. Some say it's all propaganda, a story invented to defend the right of hetaira to exist in Athenian society. Others argue the trial was real, but the disrobing was metaphorical. Either way, the myth stuck harder than the facts. And here's an odd little fringe detail. Centuries later, a Roman sculptor will carve a statue of Aphrodite based on you, and that statue will be the first nude female figure ever displayed publicly in Greek art. Before you, female nudes were taboo. After you, they're divine. So now, as the sun dips behind the Parthenon and the crowd disperses, you walk slowly back to your home. You pass the marble steps and painted urns, the men who claim to own you staring like ghosts. You're untouchable now. You're not just a courtesan, you're a concept, an empire unto yourself. You're still in Athens, but time has shifted. The marble's a little more weathered now, the shadows fall differently on the steps of the Acropolis, and now you're Aspasia. You've traded the mythic glow of Phryne's bare skin for something far more subversive. Words. Dangerous words, clever words, words that make men pause before they vote or march or declare war. You're not from here. You're from Miletus, a bustling Ionian city, and your Greek has a slight accent, one you've never tried to hide. You didn't come to Athens to find love, but love found you anyway, or at least its complicated cousin, political entanglement. His name is Pericles. Yes, that Pericles. Strategos, orator, architect of democracy. The man who wears the city like a cloak. He finds you impossible to ignore. At first, they call you his mistress. Then, more quietly, they call you his teacher. Some even say you write his speeches. You never confirm or deny. What matters is that people listen differently when he talks about war, or law, or philosophy. Your voice is in there somewhere, tucked between the vowels. You host salons in your home. Not the perfumed, idle gossip pits people assume. These are gatherings where Socrates leans against the wall and asks impossible questions, where Anaxagoras unspools the cosmos over olives and honey, where artists debate the shape of beauty with their mouths full of figs, and you, not a citizen, not a man, not even married in the legal sense, you sit in the middle of it all, guiding the discussion with the raise of an eyebrow. You're technically a hetaira like Phryne, though your skills lie more in rhetoric than seduction. Not that you lack for lovers, but your real power comes from the fact that men leave your house thinking differently than when they arrived. And sometimes, that means they vote differently. War happens or doesn't. A general is chosen, a decree passed, all because of something you said, in a room full of wine and candles. Of course, not everyone's thrilled about your influence. The comic playwrights go after you with barbed jokes. Aristophanes calls you a foreign witch. There are whispers that you perform rituals in secret, that you pull Pericles' strings with potions and cells. You find it amusing. If they can't explain your influence, they call it sorcery. Classic. But the stakes rise when war begins. The Peloponnesian War. That slow-bleeding civil war of pride and grain and Spartan steel. Pericles' popularity wavers, especially after a plague sweeps through Athens and kills thousands, including his sons. Some blame you. She turned him inward, they say. She made him weak. No one seems to remember that it was your voice that cautioned against open war in the first place. But nuance doesn't sell in the Agora. There's a moment when Pericles is formally accused of impiety. It's more about you than him. They're trying to get to you, really. He defends himself in court brilliantly, of course, and wins, but the message is clear. Your presence has shifted from tolerated to volatile. You've become a mirror they can't look into without flinching. Still, you stay. You stay even after Pericles dies, racked with illness and grief. You grieve him privately. There are no elegies for mistresses, no monuments for foreign thinkers, but you keep the salon going. The conversation must continue. There's a strange and charming scholarly debate about whether you ever officially married Pericles. Some sources say you lived as husband and wife. Others insist no legal ceremony ever occurred. But what's the legal worth of a wedding when your ideas have already fused with his policies, your conversations turned into laws? And here's a fringe detail for you. Centuries later, Renaissance scholars will argue over whether you and Pericles represent the ideal partnership between mind and state. A few Enlightenment philosophers even try to paint you as the first feminist, though the term didn't exist. And you would probably raise one eyebrow at the label. One fact historians agree on. You raise a son with Pericles, named Pericles the Younger. He becomes a general, like his father, and fights in the very war you tried to prevent. He's eventually executed by the state. You outlive them all. You die quietly, surrounded by scrolls and the ghosts of conversations. The city keeps moving, of course. Empires don't pause for widowed hetairai, But in certain circles, academic ones, political ones, your name lingers. And not just as a lover, as an intellect, as a force. You never had a throne, never led an army, but your ideas, they marched. In the end, what's more radical, a naked body in court or a woman in the centre of the most powerful democracy in the world, shaping policy with the art of her sentences? You already know the answer. And as you sit there, in your candlelit home, listening to the murmur of voices discussing the fate of the city, you smile, because they'll forget your name for a while. They always do. But eventually, someone will dig it back up and realise that behind one of history's loudest men stood a woman who whispered louder. You blink, and the marble courtyards of Athens dissolve into packed earth and lacquered ritual halls. The air turns heavy, thick with incense and the metallic scent of blood. Welcome to ancient China, deep in the Shang dynasty, where you are no courtesan in the traditional sense, but something far more layered. Fu Hao, consort, general, high priestess. Yes, you wear silk and amber like a queen, but your power isn't just symbolic. You command armies. You speak to gods. And unlike many women in this time, you don't wait to be written into history. You carve your name into it with a bronze blade. Your husband is King Wu Ding, and though he's technically the ruler of the Shang, he often defers to you. Which makes sense. You're not just a wife among many. You're the one he turns to when enemies rise on the northern border. You don't just advise, you lead. When the Two Fang rebels challenge the Shang, you ride out at the head of an army of 13,000 soldiers. You win. You bring back captives. You make offerings to the ancestors. You are both sword and shrine. The court pretends to be confused. A woman general. They whisper that perhaps the spirits favour you in some strange way, that your lineage must be unusually noble, but you and Wu Ding both know what's really going on. You're brilliant. You read oracle bones like scrolls. You understand strategy as fluently as you understand sacrifice. The king respects you because you bring him victories, and nothing silences doubt like results. Still, your power doesn't sit comfortably with everyone. There are older ministers who stiffen when you enter the hall, who look away when you take the seat usually reserved for male generals. Some try to use ritual purity as an excuse to push you back into the shadows, but you know the rituals better than they do. You use them like tools, sometimes even weapons. Here's where things get interesting. You oversee your own estate. That alone is groundbreaking. You manage land, servants and trades. No male guardian required. The records inscribed on turtle shells and ox bones even show that when sacrifices are made to ancestors, your name is invoked alongside the king's. That's not just rare, it's unprecedented. You're no mere accessory to the throne, you're part of the ruling body. And death? Death doesn't slow you down. In fact, it might make you even more powerful. After you die, possibly in childbirth, though no one's sure, Wu Ding builds you a tomb that rivals royalty. Deep underground, they bury you with 16 human attendants, dug, 460 bronzes, 590 jade pieces, 5 bone carvings, and nearly 1,000 cowrie shells. It's not just wealth, it's an announcement. You mattered. Even in the afterlife, you command an empire of skulls and silver. Fast forward a few millennia. It's the 20th century. Archaeologists stumble across your tomb at Yingxu, and what they find rewrites everything they thought they knew about Shang dynasty women. Before that, most scholars assume the ladies of the Shang court spent their lives weaving silk and looking decorative. And sure, that happened too, but you were out there building cities, burning enemies and making the gods listen. But not everyone agrees on your story. Some historians claim that the tales of your military exploits are exaggerated, that Wu Ding simply loved you so much he recorded your name in rituals. Others argue the opposite, that your power was even greater than the bones suggest and only fragments have survived. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, or maybe, as usual, history just struggles to hold the full weight of a woman who didn't behave. Now for the quirky part. Your tomb is one of the few royal graves from ancient China that was found completely intact. No looting, no collapses, just thousands of years of untouched artifacts and secrets. It's as if time itself bowed out of the way and said, "Let her rest." And here's something almost poetic. One of the weapons found buried with you is a massive battle axe, ceremonial but functional. It fits only one hand, yours. It's engraved with your name. That axe has never been used in battle, at least as far as archaeologists can tell. But you can imagine yourself holding it, standing atop a field thick with fog, issuing orders with one hand and cradling the fates of empires in the other. You didn't rise to power by accident. You weren't just beautiful or lucky. You studied, you trained, you earned your soldiers' respect. When they looked at you, they didn't see a woman pretending to be a man. They saw Fu Hao, commander of armies, daughter of the spirits, wife of the king, and equal to any man in the court. As you sit now, surrounded by bronze vessels carved with dragons and ancestors' names, you think about the balance you maintained, the line you walked between court rituals and battlefield strategy. You ruled in a time when history barely remembered women's names, but yours is carved into bone. So maybe you didn't wear the title of courtesan in the way the Greeks understood it, but your role was its own kind of seductive power, not of the flesh, but of presence. You captivated an empire not through lace and whispers, but with armour and fire. And when the oracle bones crack in the flames, and the priest peers into the fissures for answers, he finds your name etched there, asking questions, giving commands, leaving no room for silence. Your world smells like dust and linen, spices and sweat. You're in Jericho now. Yes, that Jericho, one of the oldest cities in the world, its stone walls thick enough to laugh at sieges. You run your fingers along sandstone bricks that have seen centuries of blood and prophecy. You are Rahab, and by most accounts you're a harlot. But that word, so neat and small, doesn't even scratch the surface of what you are. You deal in survival, in information, in the delicate art of knowing who's going to win before the sword is even raised. From the second-story window of your home, which is built right into Jericho's walls, you can see everything. Traders limping into the city after long desert journeys, Canaanite soldiers sharpening their spears, and whispers carried in on dry wind. You trade company for coin, yes, but more importantly, you trade silence. Secrets, a flick of the wrist, a gentle touch on a soldier's arm, and suddenly he's telling you which gate is weakest, which guard drinks too much, which priest has lost faith. And one night, 2 men knock on your door. They don't belong, you can feel it immediately. Their clothes are foreign, the dust on their sandals fresh from the Jordan River. Hebrew spies, your instincts scream at you to send them away, but something else, something older, quieter, says, keep them safe. You let them in, you hide them under stalks of flax drying on your roof. When the king's messengers come pounding on your door, demanding to know where the spies are, you lie, easily. You've lied before, but this time feels different. Bigger. You say they've already left, that if the soldiers hurry, they might still catch them. The messengers believe you and rush off into the night. Later, under the stars, you kneel beside the men you saved and whisper, I know your God is going to win. It's not flattery. It's not seduction. It's prophecy. Swear to me, you say, that when Jericho falls, you'll spare my family. They agree. You hand them a scarlet rope. Tie this to the window, they tell you. A signal, a thread of life in a city already dying. That rope, simple bright red fluttering in the breeze, becomes your lifeline. The irony isn't lost on you. In this city, where your name is half curse and half legend, it's your house and your rope and your word that determines who lives and who dies. Jericho falls, not with battering rams, but with trumpet blasts and tremors that feel like the earth itself taking sides. As walls collapse all around you, your section remains standing, somehow. The scarlet rope flutters defiantly while the city crumbles. The spies return. You're saved. Your family too. You leave Jericho behind, walking barefoot over rubble, holding tightly to the hands of kin who once wouldn't look you in the eye. The story could end there. A tidy tale of salvation. But it doesn't. You don't fade into the background of Hebrew society. You marry, possibly into the tribe of Judah. Some claim your husband is Salmon, a prince of the house of Nashon. Together you bear a son, Boaz. That name should sound familiar. Yes, the same Boaz who marries Ruth, the Moabite woman whose grandson is King David. Which means, if the line holds, that you, Rahab of Jericho, the harlot who hid spies in flax and tied red threads from her window, are an ancestor of Jesus. Now, of course, not everyone buys this lineage. Scholars debate whether Rahab the harlot and Rahab the ancestor are the same woman. Some say it's a theological mashup, a retrofitted morality tale. Others argue it's deliberate, a way to show that even the least respectable people, women on the edge of society, can shape empires, even unknowingly. And here's a weird fringe detail for your mind to chew on. In some medieval Christian texts, Rahab becomes a kind of archetype for the redeemed prostitute, a role spiritualized beyond recognition. In others, she's absorbed into allegory entirely. Jericho becomes the sinful body, and Rahab is the soul hiding grace within, which is a poetic way of erasing the sheer guts it took to lie to the king's face with soldiers outside your door. But let's pause there, because what really matters in this moment is how you walked out of that city with nothing but the clothes on your back and a thread of crimson memory. You started as a woman who had to buy protection with her body. You ended as someone whose name is folded into genealogies that shape continents. As you settle into your new life, probably still watched with suspicion, never fully accepted, you carry a strange quiet power. People don't forget what you did, some call it betrayal, others call it faith. You don't correct them. You know the truth is somewhere in the middle. What no one says aloud is that empires don't always fall because of sieges or strategies. Sometimes they fall because one woman made a decision at the right time. She listened, she calculated, and she let the future in through her door. So tonight, as you rest in a tent just beyond the ruins of your old life, the stars look a little clearer. There's no incense burning, no sandstone walls to echo your breath. Just the knowledge that in a story written mostly by men, your chapter can't be skipped. They need you to reach the next part. And whether they honour you for it or not, that's their burden, not yours. Corinth glitters under a haze of summer heat and perfume. The port is alive with sailors shouting in Phoenician, camels grumbling under the weight of indigo and spice, merchants haggling over ivory combs and jars of honey. And you glide through this cacophony like a shadow in silk. You're Lais of Corinth, famed across the Aegean, not just for your beauty, which borders on the absurd, but for your ability to make men empty their purses, their power, and occasionally their dignity, just to spend a single evening in your company. They call you the Golden Lais. Some say you're from Sicily, a refugee of war, a young girl plucked from the ashes of a sacked city and turned into a legend. Others claim you were born into luxury and chose this life because you liked the view from the top better than the view from behind a veil. The truth, as usual, is complicated and inconvenient. But what matters now is that no one in Corinth, no merchant, no general, not even the philosopher Diogenes himself, can speak your name without a twitch of desire or envy. Your price is obscene. Deliberately too, you don't work with just anyone. You charge enough to feed a household for a year, sometimes two, and the ones who can afford you, you make them wait, you make them beg, not because you enjoy cruelty, but because desire is a currency, and you understand inflation. When people have to fight to earn you, they value you more. Simple economics, but you're not just playing games, you're collecting influence. One night, a Thessalian warlord offers you a carved emerald the size of a plum, you smile and turn it down. The next morning, he doubles the offer and adds a promise that he'll support a Corinthian candidate in the next assembly vote. You accept the stone but refuse the visit. I already got what I wanted, you whisper, sliding the gem into a velvet pouch. That's the trick. You know that power doesn't always come from the act itself, but from the negotiation around it. People call you cold, calculating, but they keep coming back. They can't help themselves. You've built yourself into a myth. Every man wants to be the one who breaks through your aloof mask. And none of them do. A rival hetaira in Athens once tried to copy your methods, charging high, withholding favours, but she didn't last. She didn't understand that mystery only works if there's real substance behind it. You, on the other hand, can quote Euripides better than most scholars. You've debated Stoics over wine and won. You've refused a dozen kings and 2 tyrants. You once turned down a golden chariot saying, "It doesn't go uphill without horses and neither do I." Still, you're not untouchable. There are cracks in the legend. You've grown tired lately. The way men leer instead of listen. The way your name travels ahead of you, twisted into whatever shape the speaker prefers. Muse, temptress, witch, queen. You sometimes wonder if there's any space left for you in the persona you've built. If anyone remembers the Sicilian girl beneath the Corinthian icon, one night, while lying beside a client who fell asleep mid-boast, you get up and walk to the window. Below, the city glows like fireflies in a wine cup. Somewhere out there, a statue of Aphrodite stands in your likeness, sculpted by a man who never actually touched you, only watched from across a room and guessed. You think about that sometimes, how even stone gets to outlive you. Here's the weird bit. There's an argument among ancient sources about whether there were actually 2 women named Lais, both courtesans, one from Corinth and one from Hycera, and scholars have debated for centuries if their stories were mashed together, confused or deliberately fused into one glorious cautionary archetype. One Lais is said to have died in Thessaly, stoned to death by jealous women. The other perhaps simply faded into obscurity. Or maybe neither of those endings is true. Maybe you're still alive in the echoes of poetry and rumour. And here's your historical footnote. Despite your fame, you were never legally considered a citizen. Hetairae, no matter how wealthy or educated, couldn't vote, marry freely, or own property in their own names. You manoeuvred within those limits like a magician, owning everything, officially nothing. Your power was real, but always on loan. Tonight, a young poet shows up at your door, nervous, handsome in that unfinished way. He offers you verses instead of gold. You listen. He's good, raw, but sincere. For the first time in years, you feel something loosen inside you. Not attraction exactly, recognition. You tell him to come back tomorrow. You don't charge him. He looks stunned. In the quiet after he leaves, you smile. You're still in control, but maybe, just maybe, you're ready to loosen the grip. Let a little wind in through the curtains. Later, you hear your name drifting from a group of wine-soaked men in the agora. They're arguing whether your refusal of a king was a sign of madness or genius. You hope it was both. You walk past them, head high, feet barely touching the marble. They fall silent, and you realize once again that silence is your favourite sound. Because in a world where men wield swords and give speeches and raise armies, you wield something harder to master: hunger. You make the powerful feel powerless, and that's more dangerous than any weapon Corinth has ever forged. The air is thick with dust and conquest. You're in Asia now, miles behind Alexander the Great's front lines, and the world smells like victory mixed with sweat and smoke. Campfires flicker along the horizon. Soldiers sleep with swords under their blankets, and drunken songs ride the night breeze like wayward ghosts. You walk through it all with a lazy elegance, hips swaying, laughter slipping between your teeth like wine. You are Thaïs, and you aren't just part of Alexander's entourage. You are the chaos in his calm, the ember behind his wildfire. People whisper about you, that you're merely a hetaira who bedded generals for sport, that you're cleverer than half the strategoi combined, that you were born in Athens, trained in wit and dance and seduction, and that your company is worth more than any city on the map. All true, depending on who's telling the story, but what no one seems to grasp is that you're not drifting in Alexander's wake. You're steering it, one smirk at a time. Tonight you're deep in Persia, standing in the ruins of Persepolis, a former capital, now overrun by Macedonian soldiers drunk on power and pilfered wine. The palaces rise around you, grand, golden, built to impress gods, but to you they look like overstuffed jewelry boxes. The Persians are beaten, the city is yours, and Alexander is high on victory. He turns to you, asks what should be done with the palace of Xerxes. His eyes glitter with madness, exhaustion, and just enough flirtation to make it dangerous. You lean in, voice smooth as honey, laced with Vermilion venom, and say, "Wouldn't it be noble revenge to burn it down, for what Xerxes did to Greece?" The moment hangs. You've said it as a dare, a joke wrapped in patriotism, but Alexander laughs, and then orders torches. What follows is not a fire, but a spectacle. Drapes ignite, pillars crack, flames climb like they've been waiting centuries. The palace of Persepolis burns under a moonless sky, and you're there at the centre, dancing, literally dancing. Arms raised, hair wild, your silhouette framed by a burning empire. You've turned revenge into art, destruction into a seduction. Later, historians will argue whether it was your idea or Alexander's. Some claim he regretted it in the morning, sobered by the ashes. Others say it was all a performance, an Athenian courtesan goading king into avenging her homeland. No one can quite agree, which is exactly how you like it. You ride with the army for months after that, not like a trophy draped in silk, but as an equal of sorts. You eat with the commanders, debate logistics. You even convince Alexander to spare a town once, by quoting Euripides over breakfast. He laughs and says, "You're more dangerous than my siege weapons." Eventually you become the mistress, possibly the wife, of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most loyal generals. When the empire fractures after Alexander's death, Ptolemy takes Egypt and you go with him. This time not as a courtesan, but as royalty in all but name. You wear linen now instead of silk, trade perfume for papyrus, but your power hasn't faded. You've simply evolved. Here's the academic debate. Was your name Thaïs of Athens, or were you a native Egyptian who adopted the identity of an Athenian hetaira for prestige? Some scholars point to inconsistencies in your origin story. Others argue that your influence is overstated, that the burning of Persepolis was symbolic and spontaneous, not masterminded by a woman in a sheer tunic. But the fact that people are still debating your role 2,000 years later means you left a mark that didn't go out with the fire. And then there's this delightful oddity. In some obscure Roman texts, you're listed among the ideal courtesans, alongside Phryne, Lais, and a few mythic figures, said to embody not just beauty but strategy, charisma, and political influence. Your entry includes a note: "She set fire to a kingdom and still walked away clean." That's the thing. You never pretended to be innocent. You understood that power comes from proximity, from being the one in the tent when the map is redrawn. You watched Alexander carve the world into pieces and chose which shard to stand on. You whispered when others shouted, laughed when others plotted, danced when others begged. Some nights, be it in Alexandria, your new home, you climb to the roof and look out over the city. A Greek dream planted in Egyptian soil, a monument to ambition. You wonder if Alexander would have liked it, or if he would have burned it down too, given the chance. You touch the stone under your fingers, still warm from the sun, and smile. Fire built this, in a way. You're fire. People expect you to vanish quietly, a footnote in someone else's story. But the truth is, you've become folklore. Songs still mention you. Plays reenact your dances. Your name circulates in taverns and temples alike, and in the darker corners of memory. Whenever someone smells smoke and sees a woman laughing in its glow, they think of you. Because you didn't just witness the burning of an empire, you lit the match. The ground under your feet is crumbling. Not just metaphorically, actual stones once carved by kings are breaking apart as Babylon groans under its own weight. You are not a queen, not a general, not a priestess tonight. You are something softer, stranger, and far more dangerous in this particular moment. A palace courtesan in the twilight of an empire. You live behind perfumed screens and silver-threaded curtains in the court of King Samsu-Ditana, the last ruler of Babylon before it falls to the Medes and the Elamites, and whoever else decides to take a bite. No one talks about courtesans when they talk about the collapse of civilizations, but you're here, you see it all. You know the schedules of generals, the mood swings of ministers, the hidden stashes of grain and wine and gold, and what's more, men talk when they think you're just being polite. They confess when they think you're decoration. You've learnt the names of spies. You know which provinces are ready to revolt. You even know which city gates are most vulnerable and which soldiers are too drunk to notice a ladder. And tonight, you whisper some of that into the ear of a man who is not Babylonian. You don't know his true name. He says he's a merchant. Sure, a merchant with calloused hands and military boots, smelling faintly of camel sweat and iron. He listens to you with the stillness of a man who's memorizing every word. When you press your lips to his ear, giving him the timing of a guard rotation near the northern wall, you feel him smile. Are you a traitor? Maybe. But this city has stopped protecting you. It's collapsing from the inside. Samsu-Ditana, once a symbol of strength, is barely holding court anymore. He drinks too much, talks too slowly. He ignores the omens, the cracked liver readings, the dreams of fire and stars falling. And meanwhile, you've watched grain prices triple and street priests take up swords. There are no citizens left here, only survivors. The palace women know what's coming. You're not the only one passing notes, dropping hints to the merchants and visitors in the harem's shaded halls. There's a whole whisper network now, quiet as silk and sharp as flint. You pass messages in embroidery patterns. You hum songs that map escape routes. And when the right ears are listening, you turn your body into a code, every touch and glance, a signal. Of course, not all scholars agree on how much influence courtesans had in Babylon's fall. Some argue the city was already doomed, no need for pillow talk espionage. But then there's the strange consistency in the tablets, the way some names show up again and again in royal archives and then suddenly disappear just before the final siege. Some historians suspect those were your sisters in seduction, women who made deals in the dark and walked away before the torches were lit. And here's the odd little fringe fact. After the city fell, several invaders reported finding caches of grain and gold already set aside, as if someone inside had prepared for them. Smooth. Too smooth. like someone had mapped it all out before the first battering ram touched stone. But back to you. The night it happens, the air is thick with a storm that never quite arrives. You can feel the electricity on your skin, taste the tension in your mouth like spoiled wine. From your rooftop garden, yes, even at the end, the palace kept its gardens. You watch smoke rise near the gates. It's not chaos yet, but it will be. You slip on a soft green veil, not to hide but to signal. Your contact will recognize it. You descend the stairs slowly, listening to the sounds below, sandals scraping against tiles, soft whimpers from the newer girls, and somewhere the thud of a drunk guard collapsing. When the walls are breached, the screaming doesn't start all at once. It's like a cracking glass, silent at first, then suddenly shattering. You move quickly, gathering what you can. Not jewels, you've already hidden those, but a tablet you stole weeks ago from a distracted scribe. It lists names. People who funded the army's decline, people who fled early, people who might pay to keep their secrets buried. You slip into the shadows, blend with the rush of fleeing servants, and vanish through a servant's passage you memorized months ago. Your merchant is waiting. He doesn't say thank you, but he takes your hand. Behind you, Babylon burns. The next day, the invaders take what they want. Statues are pulled down, temples are desecrated. Samsu-Ditana is never seen again. Some say he died in the throne room, whispering prayers to gods who had already packed up and left. Others believe he fled and lived out his days as a wandering priest, mumbling to himself about stars and snakes. You're already gone. There's no record of where you end up. Not officially, but some say a mysterious woman begins appearing in the courts of the Mies, then later in Elam speaking flawless Akkadian and even better Sumerian. A woman who carries herself like a queen but never claims a throne. A woman who never pays for anything twice, and years later, when Babylon is rebuilt, different, quieter, changed, your name still lingers in the spaces between walls. A song some of the older women hum when they sweep the palace floors. A pattern under the tiles that matches the embroidery you used to stitch. A whisper about the girl who saw an empire's end before anyone else and decided not to go down with it. Because sometimes the key to power isn't who wears the crown, it's who knows where the locks are. The sun glints off the Nile like it's showing off, gold flickering across water that's seen more betrayal than forgiveness. You're in Egypt now, but not just any Egypt. Ptolemaic Egypt. A strange, decadent hybrid of Greek precision and Egyptian grandeur. You are Cleopatra VII, and no, this is not the overpainted Halloween version of you with the snake crown and the tragic eyeliner. This is the real you, the woman with a political chessboard spread across 3 continents and a voice that could lull wolves. They'll tell your story 100 ways, seductress, temptress, manipulator, but they always skip the most dangerous part of your power, your mind. Let's set the stage. You're born into chaos. Your family is a Game of Thrones with actual poisonings, throat slittings, and strategic drownings. You become queen at 18 and co-rule with your 10-year-old brother, who is also your husband, because the gods have a dark sense of humour. Spoiler, you don't plan to share the spotlight. You're fluent in 9 languages, the only Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who bothers to learn Egyptian. You quote Homer, read medical texts, debate taxes, and conduct business from a golden barge, and yes, you use your beauty, but never without a blade behind it. Enter Julius Caesar. He arrives in Alexandria with Roman steel and arrogance, dragging your city into his power games. Your brother tries to lock you out, so you pull one of your most iconic stunts. You'd sneak into Caesar's chambers rolled up in a carpet, not for show, for strategy. You emerge with dishevelled hair and a diplomatic agenda. You don't bat your lashes, you lay out a plan for power sharing, resource control, and political survival. Caesar listens. He always did have a weakness for bold moves. You become his lover, yes, but also his partner. He installs you back on the throne. You have a son, Caesarion, and for a brief, glittering moment, you believe Rome and Egypt might entwine without strangling each other. But Rome has a short attention span and an even shorter tolerance for powerful foreign women. When Caesar is assassinated, you don't collapse. You pivot. Enter Mark Antony. Rugged, ambitious, emotionally chaotic. You meet him not with desperation, but with choreography. You sail into Tarsus on a barge of silver and silk dressed as Aphrodite, flanked by flute players. Not because you're vain, but because you understand myth. You are the myth, and when Antony meets you, he doesn't stand a chance. Your first conversations aren't pillow talk, they're war talk. naval strategy, territorial governance. You don't seduce him, you recruit him. Together, you carve out power like sculptors chipping away at marble. But Rome watches, and Octavian, future Augustus, tightens his grip on public opinion like a noose. He paints you as the Eastern witch who bewitched the noble Antony, which is hilarious, considering you fund hospitals and build temples, while he's still figuring out how to stop looking like a boy. Still, propaganda is a hell of a drug. Rome turns, the war comes, Antony loses battle after battle, your alliance frays, you both see the writing on the temple wall, and it's not written in hieroglyphs, it's Latin, and it's spelling doom. Now the part you know, you retreat to your mausoleum with your treasure and your final plans. Antony falls on his sword. You follow, according to legend, with a snake bite. Regal, mysterious, painful, and maybe fake. Because here's the debate that keeps scholars up at night. Did Cleopatra actually die by asp? Some say no, that the story was concocted by Octavian's people to tie a neat, poetic bow around your legacy, that you were captured and executed, or poisoned yourself with a fast-acting concoction. No one knows for sure. The asp is romantic, marketable, but suspiciously tidy. And then there's this fringe theory, that you didn't die at all, that a body double was used, and you escaped with Caesarian or a loyal guard vanishing into the desert or into another court, living out your days under another name. It's probably fantasy, but the idea lingers, because your myth is too sharp to fade. What is true is that after your death, Egypt becomes just another Roman province. The last pharaoh is gone. The line ends with you. But here's the thing, no other woman in history has been blamed for quite so much empire collapse while being simultaneously so admired, feared, and fetishized. You became an eternal symbol of feminine manipulation, as if no man you ever dealt with had a mind of his own. And let's talk legacy. Coins minted with your face show a strong profile, not a pretty one. You didn't cater to aesthetics, you declared dominance. You had ships, scientists, and schools. You held Egypt together through famine, war, and Roman tantrums. And you did it while being treated like a walking threat simply because you refused to sit quietly in the background of someone else's story. You weren't a courtesan in the traditional sense, but the world treated you like one, fixating on who you slept with instead of what you built. But you used that attention. You turned gazes into allies, desire into diplomacy. If you weaponized seduction, it was only because the empire handed you a battlefield and dared you to win without an army. You didn't just control men, you controlled narrative, and in the end, even Octavian couldn't erase you. He won the war, but you got the iconography, statues, paintings, films, Halloween costumes. And under all that drama, one enduring truth, Cleopatra didn't seduce Rome, she outsmarted it. For as long as it could be outsmarted. The morning sun creeps over the mango groves, and the city of Vaishali hums with life. Vendors call out from under brightly coloured awnings, clinking coins and measuring spices with practiced flicks of the wrist. You walk among them, bare feet whispering over warm stone, draped in a silk sari dyed with crushed lotus petals. You are Amrapali, the Nagar Vadu, the royal courtesan of Vaishali, and while most women are judged by who they marry, you are judged by how well you represent an entire city, and you represent it very well. Vaishali isn't just any city. Is the crown jewel of the Lichavi Republic, a place known for its progressive politics and devotion to the arts. Instead of queens, they elect officials. Instead of palaces, they raise halls for public debate. And somewhere in between that civic pride and spiritual ambition, they decided that a courtesan, one woman chosen for her beauty, intelligence, and artistry, should be the face of the city's culture and refinement. That woman is you. You were born to unknown parents, probably of a low caste, abandoned under a mango tree. You could have been another forgotten girl in a country full of them, but fate, or maybe sheer defiance, had other plans. You were raised by a gardener, taught to read and sing and debate. Your beauty grew alongside your mind, and by the time you reached adolescence, the Lichavi nobles couldn't ignore you. So they held a ceremony, and you were named Nagarvadu. Not a concubine, not a common dancer, but a state-sponsored embodiment of grace and culture. It sounds glorious, and sometimes it is. You live in a grand home, you host musicians, poets, kings, you dine beside Brahmins and teach philosophy to princes, but there's a price. You belong to no one, but also to everyone. You're not allowed to marry, your body is a public symbol, your personal life a matter of civic interest. Every lover you take becomes a political message, and oh, the men try. Generals, merchants, even a royal cousin or two, they line up outside your residence, hoping to be chosen for a night that might linger in memory or legend. But you're not seduced by titles or silks. You choose based on your own criteria: conversation, wit, a well-placed metaphor. You once dismissed a visiting prince because he confused Vishnu and Shiva in a poem. He never quite recovered from the humiliation. Still, you're lonely. Adored, yes, but rarely understood. And then one day word spreads. A sage is coming to Vaishali, a man who speaks of detachment, of inner peace, of walking away from pleasure to find something deeper. A man called Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. You're curious but skeptical. You've heard men preach before. They usually want attention or donations or worse. But when you attend one of his talks, quietly veiled, sitting behind a painted screen, you feel something shift. He doesn't leer. He doesn't flatter. He speaks with a strange compassion, a kind of radiant stillness. And when he talks about suffering, you feel as though he sees yours. You begin inviting him to your home, not as a lover, but as a teacher. Your conversations are private, intense, full of questions no one else dares to ask. He doesn't judge you for being a courtesan. In fact, he treats you with more respect than the nobles who praise your dance but scorn your choices. Eventually, you offer him a gift, your mango grove, the same one where you were found as a child. It's quiet, lush, peaceful, a perfect place for meditation. He accepts, and that grove becomes one of his favoured retreats. For that, your name is etched into the Buddhist canon, not as a sinner turned saint, but as someone who simply chose differently. Here's the historical fact. The Pali Canon, among the earliest Buddhist texts, mentions you by name. Amrapali, the courtesan who offered her garden to the Buddha. Some later texts describe your decision to renounce wealth and position to become a follower of the Dharma. Whether this happened literally or symbolically is debated, but your story is one of transformation, not from shame to virtue, but from obligation to freedom. There's an ongoing scholarly argument about how much of your story is history and how much is hagiography. Some say the Lichavis would never elevate a lowborn woman. Others argue that your position as Nagavadhu was always intended to be a complicated mix of reverence and control. Either way, the myth stuck, and you remain one of the few women mentioned by name in ancient Indian religious literature, courtesan or not. And here's a strange fringe detail. In some later legends, it's said that Amrapali was so beautiful that flowers would bloom where she walked, and that even animals would go quiet in her presence. It's almost laughable, like beauty itself was a kind of magical spell, but maybe it was. Maybe the real spell was your ability to turn heads without losing your own. In the years that follow, you do renounce your title, you give up your wealth, you wear plain robes and walk barefoot among the very people who once envied you. Some mock you, some pity you, but others, especially women, begin to follow your example. Because while kings built temples and waged wars, you built space, a place of quiet, a legacy of service, a reminder that even in the most unlikely of lives there is room for something sacred. As you sit in your mango grove, listening to the rustle of wind through the trees, you realize something. You were never truly owned by this city. You used its gaze, wore it like a costume, but you always knew there was more waiting beyond the applause. And now, in this strange, peaceful stillness, you finally belong to yourself. The streets of Rome throb with heat and tension, both political and personal, the kind of energy that makes temples feel more like performance stages, and the Senate sound like a particularly dramatic dinner party. You're walking through this, sandals soft against the dust, the hem of your stola catching whispers and stares in equal measure. You are Clodia, not just a Roman noblewoman, not just a scandal, but a walking contradiction. Educated but reckless, aristocratic but wild, and absolutely deliciously uncontainable. They call you the Medea of the Palatine, and maybe that's fair. You've got the brains for poetry and the teeth for blood. You come from one of Rome's most powerful families, the Claudi Pulchri, rich, old, and politically ruthless. You marry young into another noble family, more out of obligation than interest. The husband dies under questionable circumstances. People talk, they always do, you don't bother correcting them. But here's the truth that doesn't make it into the Senate scrolls. You're terrifyingly smart, fluent in Greek, versed in philosophy, capable of holding your own with Cicero in a debate which, to be clear, is like intellectually wrestling a barracuda. You host lavish salons where poets drink too much and politicians say things they regret the next morning. You don't just move in elite circles, you shape them. And then there's the poetry. Oh, the poetry. Not yours, technically. At least not the surviving stuff, but they're poems about you. Endless. Most come from Catullus, the Roman poet who falls madly, humiliatingly in love with you. He calls you Lesbia in his verses, a nod to Sappho, which tells you a lot about how he wants to see you. As both muse and threat, soft and savage, he writes of stolen kisses, sleepless nights, betrayal, obsession. You sleep with him, then ghost him, then take him back, then ghost him again. He never recovers. But here's the layered thing, those poems that blame you for breaking his heart. They're also the most lyrical things Rome has ever produced. Your refusal to be what he wants makes his genius bloom. You inspire not because you love, but because you refuse to apologize. Eventually, the games turn dangerous. You're accused publicly of adultery, poisoning, even incest with your brother Clodius Pulcher, a populist tribune who delights in stirring the political pot until it overflows. Rome is divided. The patricians want your head. The plebeians, they cheer. Because even in scandal you embody something they love, a woman who won't be quiet. The trial that follows is infamous. Your accuser is Marcus Caelius Rufus, your former lover, now enemy. Your defender, Cicero himself, because Roman life really is just one long brutal soap opera. In his speech, Cicero doesn't pull punches. He calls you wild, insatiable, a drunk, a seductress, a danger to morality. But even as he slanders you, he can't help but sound fascinated. It's as if you're a myth he's trying to put back in a box and failing miserably. Historians still debate the outcome. The records go quiet after that. Some think you retreated from public life, others that you simply reinvented yourself, moving through the shadows of Roman high society like a ghost in silk. But the poetry, it stayed. It lasted. Catullus immortalized you, whether he meant to or not. There's a wonderful scholarly debate around Lesbia's real identity. While most agree she's Clodia, a few argue that she might have been a composite, a symbol of Roman femininity unhinged, eroticized and vilified. But the timeline fits too neatly and the personality is too vivid to be fiction. You weren't invented. You were remembered exactly because you were impossible to forget. And here's a quirky fact. Your name, Clodia, is often confused in later texts with Claudia, leading to a whole tangle of mistaken identities in historical and literary references. You've been split and spliced across centuries, turned into everything from a poetic muse to a cautionary tale, which is honestly just more evidence of how thoroughly you haunted the Roman imagination. What makes you unique among courtesans and aristocrats alike is how fully you owned your contradictions. You weren't a demure matron, nor a passive concubine. You were both a patrician and a predator. You used the weight of your lineage as a shield and your body as bait. But it was your mind, sharp, unapologetic and strategic, that made you dangerous. Because you understood something most Roman women were never taught. In a world ruled by laws, rumours are sometimes more powerful. You made your enemies chase your shadow while you sat back and listened to their heartbeat accelerate. Tonight you sit on your terrace, a scroll of Catullus's poetry in your lap, rereading his angry devotion with a half-smile. He calls you fickle, he calls you cruel, but between the insults he carves out your legacy in verse so lovely it stings. And tomorrow you'll host another salon where senators will pretend not to stare and poets will pretend not to hope. You'll pour wine, recite Sappho, and let the mystery build. Because while Rome prides itself on strength, order and tradition, you've made your name by tearing those apart with a glance. The applause dies slowly, like ripples in a wineglass. You step off the stage, pearls swinging at your throat, and the scent of sweat and sandalwood thick in your lungs. Rome again, but not the polished marble of the Forum or the moralizing gloom of the Senate. This is a different Rome, one of stage curtains and dressing rooms, of borrowed wigs and political rumours traded in the shadows. You are Volumnia Cytheris, and while they call you an actress, a courtesan, even a slave depending on who's speaking and how drunk they are, what you really are is essential. You were born a slave in a household that didn't expect much from you, except maybe silence and obedience. But you had something else, timing, memory, the gift of mimicry. So they trained you as a mime, a performer in the bawdiest, bloodiest, most deliciously unsubtle theatre Rome could offer. You learned how to weep on cue, how to deliver lines that made soldiers blush, how to catch a senator's eye and hold it hostage. Eventually, you were freed. Volumnia became your formal name. Cytheris, that came later, a stage name, a flirtation with Aphrodite, because let's be honest, what's a courtesan without a bit of branding? Your fame grows quickly, you tour the provinces with your troupe, but your real stage is in private, in the bedrooms of the powerful, the corridors just off the Senate chamber, the hushed gatherings where wine flows and egos leak. You become the mistress of Marcus Antonius. Yes, that Mark Antony. Back when he was just a rising star, still chasing Caesar's shadow, still deciding whether he was hero or villain. He doesn't keep you secret. Oh no. He rides through Rome with you beside him in a chariot, shocking every decent Roman matron clinging to her pearls. You're dressed in silks, your hair oiled and coiled into perfect spirals, waving like a queen in a city that has no throne for women like you. The senators are furious. The people, they cheer, because deep down they love the spectacle. But that kind of visibility comes with a price. The more Rome sees you, the more it wants to take you apart. You're mocked in the streets, parodied in plays, whispered about in alleyways. They call you an opportunist, a whore with lines memorized. But you've read more philosophy than half the men judging you. You've sat at dinner with Cicero, countered his cynicism with something softer, sharper. You're not climbing by accident. You've studied the staircase. Of course, Antony is volatile. Charismatic, brilliant, and emotionally chaotic. He adores you, until he doesn't. Eventually your romance fades, pushed aside by politics and power plays. You don't cry about it, you pivot. And that's what makes you dangerous. You're not in love with the men you meet. You're in love with their potential, their proximity to influence. Your next affair is with Brutus. Yes, that Brutus. The one with the knife, the toga, the famous last words. You joke once that you have a type, doomed revolutionaries with mother issues. He doesn't laugh. Too serious, too clenched. But you stay anyway, because Brutus needs you. He needs someone who isn't wrapped in marble idealism, someone who understands the stage of public opinion better than he does. You help him craft speeches. You tell him how to hold his hands when he speaks. You adjust his metaphors like you're fixing his collar. He listens, then stabs Caesar. There's a debate among scholars about whether you are a true courtesan or simply an actress with high-profile lovers. But the line was always thin in Rome. Performance was performance, on stage, in bed, in politics. What mattered was how well you could deliver a role, and you, Cytheris, were a master of roles. Seductress, confidant, political advisor, muse, and here's a bizarre fringe tidbit. Some records suggest that you briefly returned to the theatre after your relationships with Brutus and Antony ended, that you took the stage again, not as a desperate woman clinging to fame, but as a living myth. Audiences showed up not just for the performance, but for you, the woman who'd slept with history and survived. Of course, the Roman elite hated it. A woman who dared to be famous for her own reasons, not because of who fathered her or married her. Blasphemy! They tried to erase you. And for the most part they succeeded. The records grow thin after your prime. Your name disappears into the footnotes of others, men whose glory depended in part on your presence. But every now and then, a name surfaces in a surviving letter, a half-crumbled invoice, a scratched amphora label, Cytheris. And when it does, it sparks debate. Who was she really? A manipulator? A pawn and a sauveteur? Maybe all three. Maybe none. Tonight you sit in your modest villa just outside Rome, a little older, less adorned, the silver in your hair catching candlelight. You still recite lines sometimes under your breath. Euripides, Plautus, a few of your own. You drink watered wine and watch the shadows dance, remembering when you stood beside giants and whispered into their ears. You weren't born into power. You couldn't vote, couldn't own land, couldn't speak in court, but you did something rarer. You got them to listen when you spoke anyway. You played the game better than most of the men in it, and you made them applaud while you did. Because in a city built on theatre, what's more powerful than the woman who knows exactly when to drop the curtain? The desert wind rolls in like a whisper from the edge of myth, stirring the dust of camels' hooves and spiced incense from traders' satchels. You are standing on the cusp of legend, where history starts to blur and shimmer into story. You are Bilqis, or maybe not. You are the woman the world will come to know as the Queen of Sheba. But before the crown, before the scrolls, before the pilgrimage that would make you famous across continents, you were something far stranger. A merchant queen, a courtesan by reputation, a sovereign by wit. And everything about you is just slippery enough to survive a time's tight grip. Your kingdom is Saba, deep in the folds of southern Arabia, what modern maps might call Yemen. It's a land of frankincense and gold, of myrrh and honey, and it's yours, not by inheritance, not by accident, but by manoeuvring so brilliant it looks effortless from a distance. The priests say you were chosen by the gods, the traders say you bought the throne one favour at a time, your rivals say you're a whore who charmed her way into power. Let them. You sip pomegranate wine and smile. There's a murmur in your court, stories of a great king far to the north, a man of impossible wisdom, Solomon. You've heard the name before. Rumours arrive on spice routes long before armies do. His people say he commands demons and birds, that he speaks to animals, that no question confuses him. You find the whole thing charming and a little insulting, as if he's the only sovereign who can handle a clever riddle. So you pack your camels, you choose your finest silks, you bring perfumes that make even the dust smell sweet. You ride not just as a guest, but as a test. If he is truly wise, he'll recognise what you are. Not a wife, not a temptress, an equal. The journey is long, but you make an entrance. You arrive in Jerusalem with enough splendour to tilt the city's rhythm, and Solomon receives you in his great stone palace, surrounded by cedar columns and gold leaf everything. You speak with him, publicly, privately. You ask him riddles, real ones, not just flirtatious games. What flows without legs and dies if trapped? What rises in silence and leaves no shadow? He answers all of them. Eventually you start to respect him. And then there's the rumour, the juicy one, that the two of you become lovers, that your visit stretches far beyond protocol, that when you leave, you carry more than gifts, maybe a child, maybe a prophecy. It depends on who's telling the story. Ethiopian tradition says you give birth to Menelik the Thaïs, the first emperor of Ethiopia, who goes on to found a dynasty that claims descent from you and Solomon all the way into the 20th century. That's nearly 3,000 years of myth riding on your womb. No pressure. But other scholars argue that the entire affair is just a mashup of trade alliances, political pageantry, and good old-fashioned biblical PR. There's no hard evidence that you and Solomon ever met. Some say the Queen of Sheba was never a real person at all, just a narrative device, a literary archetype meant to test and confirm Solomon's wisdom, the woman as question, the woman as trap. But you know better, because your name appears not just in the Bible, but in the Quran, in Ethiopian chronicles, and across a dozen ancient inscriptions buried in Arabian ruins. You have a temple in Marib. You have stories passed through generations, not just about your beauty, but about your ability to trade, to negotiate, to lead. You aren't just admired, you're emulated. And here's a fun fringe theory. Some believe you were originally a priestess of the moon goddess Almaka, and that your reputation as a courtesan came not from scandal, but from religious rites misunderstood by outsiders. Sacred sexuality, temple offerings, things the later scribes turned into something dirtier, as they tend to do. Tonight, back in your palace, you unfasten your golden girdle and let your hair fall down your back. You sit on a carved sandalwood bench overlooking the desert, cool now under the stars. You remember Solomon's eyes, clever, careful, curious, a man who understood the game because he played it too, not as enemies, not as lovers perhaps, but as mirrors. There's no shame in the stories they tell about you. If they want to call you a courtesan, let them. You took a 1,000-year-old trade route and turned it into a diplomatic weapon. You used silk and scent the way generals use spears, and you did it all while men argued about what a woman's place should be. You were never a riddle to be solved. You were the answer disguised as a question, and they're still trying to figure you out. Because centuries later, when little girls in Ethiopia sing your name, or when scholars in dusty libraries puzzle over your inscriptions, you remain elusive. A queen, yes, but also a symbol, of female power wrapped in perfume, of diplomacy performed in heels, of wisdom disguised as beauty, and in the morning you'll send out another caravan, more myrrh, more gold, and perhaps tucked among the crates a letter written in your delicate script. Not to Solomon, but to someone else, someone new, someone rising, because you're always watching, always listening, and always ready to remind the world that empires don't run on conquest alone. Sometimes they run on charm, strategy, and a perfectly timed smile. The parchment crackles softly under your fingers, warm from the afternoon sun that slips through a carved screen. Outside, the imperial court of Han China pulses with the quiet precision of power. Eunuchs shuffle past with scrolls, officials murmur over taxes and grain yields, and somewhere in the distance the clack of bamboo slips being tallied echoes through the warm marble halls. But here in your chamber, behind layers of etiquette and silence, you write. You are Ban Zhao, and though the world sees you as a widow tucked inside the folds of the imperial harem, you are in fact rewriting the rules of civilization, one brushstroke at a time. Born into the Ban family, one of the most respected scholarly lineages of the Eastern Han dynasty, you grow up surrounded by scrolls and debates. Your father is a historian. Your brother Ban Gu begins compiling the monumental Book of Han, the official history of the dynasty. When he dies mid-sentence, it is you who picks up the brush. Not publicly, not loudly, women don't get titles for this kind of thing, but every page you complete carries the weight of your name, even if the world doesn't ink it in. You're technically not a courtesan, not by the Greek or Roman definition. But in the imperial Chinese court, the term takes on a different shape. You're an inner court woman of high status, educated, widowed young, and therefore permanently cloistered. But your intellect buys you something unusual: access. You are summoned by empresses and consorts. You serve as a tutor to Empress Dongsui herself. When she wants to understand statecraft or refine her proclamations, she calls for you. And so, in a court where women are mostly expected to look beautiful and remain quiet, you instead become a political whisper in embroidered robes. At night you write. Your most famous work is the Nujie Lessons for Women, a text that, on the surface, appears to be a manual of obedience. You advise women to be humble, silent, submissive to their husbands, devoted to domestic work. It's easy to read and scoff. Internalized patriarchy, modern readers might say. A handbook for female suppression, but it's not quite that simple, because beneath the docile phrases lies a shrewd message. Education matters. You argue that women, even in servitude, must be educated, that harmony in a household comes from wisdom, not just obedience. You're working within a system that would ignore you if you openly challenged it. So instead, you lace your ideas in silk, soft on the outside, unbreakable underneath. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Nujie a capitulation to patriarchal norms or a subversive attempt to empower women from within the cage? The jury is still out. Some say you are reinforcing gender hierarchies, that your work prolonged women's suffering. Others believe you are laying the groundwork for a different kind of rebellion, the long game. Teaching girls to read, after all, is the first step to making them question what they're reading. You don't stop there. You also finish your brother's Book of Han, shaping one of the most important historical records in Chinese literature. Do they credit you on the front? No, but they can't unwrite what you wrote. Your fingerprints are on the bones of an empire, no matter how many men tried to hold the quill themselves. And here's a little-known, strange detail. While your Nujie was passed down through dynasties as a primer for proper female conduct, copies of your lesser-known poetry and essays quietly circulated among the literate elite. Some describe you as playful, even flirtatious. In one lost poem, quoted centuries later by a Tang-era scholar, you reportedly compares the imperial bureaucracy to a harem itself, full of fragile alliances, veiled rivalries, and the constant threat of exile. Subtle shade? Possibly. Genius? Absolutely. You live your life entirely within the court, surrounded by concubines, eunuchs, scholars, and scrolls. You don't remarry, which is radical for your time. Instead, you dedicate yourself to writing and teaching. You mentor girls from noble families, coaching them in calligraphy, classics, and quiet ambition. You don't lead armies, you don't seduce emperors, but you shape empresses, and through them, policy. At some point, you become a rumor. They say Ban Zhao knows things no woman should know, that she reads tax records in the bath and corrects legal documents in her sleep, that if you anger her, she'll rewrite your family history with a stroke of ink, and if you're kind, she might slip your name into a poem and make you immortal. You die peacefully, in the court that both restricted and revered you. Your name becomes a staple in educational texts, but always in a neatly labelled box. Female moralist, Confucian scholar, model widow, as if that were all. But centuries later, women read your work and see something else. Not a scold, not a puppet, a strategist, someone who took the only tools she had, ink, paper, silence, and built a foundation where none existed. You didn't storm the palace gates, you moved inside them quietly, and then rearranged the furniture. And tonight, as the lanterns flicker in your study and your brushed wool dances across the page, you imagine your words carrying forward, not just through dynasties, but across oceans and centuries, to women with loud voices, to women with no voices, to anyone who understands that sometimes revolution starts with a footnote. The floor is marble, the walls are gold, and the throne is hollow. Welcome to imperial Rome, high in its decadence and dizzy on its own propaganda. You're standing in the shadow of an emperor, but not just any emperor. Claudius, the shy, bookish one, the man whose rise surprised everyone, especially himself. And at his side, that would be you, Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, wife, mother, and if the rumours are to be believed, nymphomaniac, conspirator, courtesan in a crown. Let's be clear, no woman earns that many titles without crossing a few swords. You begin like many noble women, young, beautiful, and strategic. Your family's prestigious, the bloodline clean, and the political alliance is tight. You marry Claudius early, back when no one thought he'd ever sit on the throne. He's older, awkward, book smart, but people dumb, and honestly, that suits you fine, because it leaves a lot of room to operate behind the curtain. When Claudius becomes emperor, suddenly you're elevated to the top of Roman society, not just rich or well-connected, but divine, the mother of his heir, the Augusta. But instead of retreating into piety or hiding behind your husband's robes like a well-behaved matron, you take that power and stretch it until it screams. You begin collecting lovers like imperial souvenirs, senators, actors, gladiators, slaves. You don't discriminate, only accumulate. The palace staff keeps quiet for the most part. After all, you control appointments. You decide which noble gets invited to dinner and which one mysteriously falls ill on the way. You're not just Claudius's wife, you're the empress in practice, pushing appointments, manipulating court cases, pulling strings on everything from land disputes to executions. The public loves to gossip. They say you sneak out at night in disguise to work in a brothel, offering your services under a fake name for the thrill of degradation. They say you host wild parties in the palace, where politics and pleasure blend until no one remembers who swore loyalty to whom or in what position. Are any of these stories true? Maybe, maybe not. But they circulate fast, and you do nothing to stop them. Because what people don't understand is that scandal is its own form of armour. If they're focused on who you're sleeping with, they won't notice how you're stacking favours, forging alliances, and quietly building your own imperial network. But you're not just indulging, you're planning. One of your most audacious moves comes when Claudius is away. You marries your lover, Gaius Silius, in what some claim is a mock wedding, others a genuine coup attempt. Either way, it's not subtle. Rome blinks. Even the palace guards seem confused. You're already empress. What could you possibly gain by marrying someone else? Here's the debated bit. Was this truly a plot to overthrow Claudius, or a grotesque private joke you took too far? Some ancient historians frame it as a treasonous power grab. Others say it was an open secret gone wrong, a parody of legitimacy meant to humiliate the emperor. You never get the chance to explain. Because Claudius returns, and he doesn't hesitate. Your name is struck from official records, your statues are smashed, Gaius Silius is executed. You flee, some say barefoot, others say in full regalia, hiding in the gardens of the emperor's former wife. You beg, you cry, you offer your son as a bargaining chip. But the orders are clear, you are to die, Sor. And not publicly, not like a noblewoman, quietly. Like a servant who's outlived her usefulness. They send a soldier, you refuse to take your own life despite tradition, so he finishes it for you. Fast, final, forgettable, except, not really, because Messalina, the name itself, becomes a shorthand for decadence, for the dangerous woman, the insatiable wife, the empress who behaved like a courtesan and dared to wield her sexuality like a blade. You're remembered less for policy than for appetite. Less for strategy than scandal. But let's not pretend that wasn't part of the plan. Here's the historical funhouse mirror. Later Roman emperors engaged in far more depraved behaviour. But because you were a woman, your excess was never framed as imperial, it was criminal. You had too much agency. You wanted too much, and worse, you enjoyed it. That was unforgivable. And then there's this curious fringe detail. Some suggest the brothel rumour came from one source only. Juvenal, the satirical poet, writing decades after your death. A man who never met you, but knew what sold copies. Scholars today still argue over whether that part of your legend was real or crafted as anti-feminine propaganda. It doesn't matter, the image stuck. You were made into a cautionary tale, Don't be like Messalina, but maybe that's a misreading. Maybe the real lesson was, don't let Messalina find your weakness, because she will use it and she will win. Until she doesn't. Still, tonight, as the moon rises over Rome and flickers across the forum, your shadow lingers. Tourists walk past your broken statue and don't know your name, but the word Messalina, it echoes. In books, in films, in whispered comparisons, you've become a symbol, a warning, a myth. But here's the thing, a woman doesn't have to survive history to influence it. Sometimes she just has to terrify it enough to be remembered. The garden is quiet. Too quiet for Athens, really. There's no shouting in the streets, no drunken arguments about democracy, no flute girls playing for raucous symposiums. Just the soft crunch of gravel beneath your feet and the distant murmur of a water fountain carved to resemble a lion's mouth. You're in Epicurus's garden, a sort of philosopher's utopia tucked just outside the city walls. A haven for thought, for pleasure, for the quiet exploration of what it means to live well. And you tonight are Leontian. You've heard the names they whisper about you. Hetaira, Philosophissa, that wild thing who dared to argue with men in public and sleep with them in private. You've been called a courtesan and a scholar in the same breath, which confuses the same men who claim to love both poetry and logic. You confuse them. That's part of the joy. Leontian. Born into no house of note, no gilded Athenian pedigree. Like many hetairai, you were trained early in conversation, music, and charm. But somewhere along the line, you decided charm wasn't enough. You wanted ideas, so you infiltrated the one place most women didn't belong, philosophical circles. Not by begging or by seducing. You got in by debating, by pushing back, by proving you had the mental fire to scorch anyone who tried to keep you out. Which is how you ended up here among Epicureans. Epicurus, yes, that Epicurus, the philosopher of pleasure and moderation, isn't afraid of women in his circle. In fact, he welcomes them. He recognizes that truth doesn't wear a beard or speak in a deep voice. In his garden, you read alongside other female thinkers like Themista of Lampsacus. You lie on the grass, stroll in hand and argue about atoms and ethics. And when you speak, men actually listen. That doesn't mean the world accepts you. The Stoics and the Peripatetics outside the garden call you a whore pretending to be wise. One critic even writes that you have neither grace nor reason. Another, possibly Theophrastus himself, claims your mind is polluted by your body. You laugh when you hear this, because in their world, wisdom and sex aren't allowed to coexist. In yours, they're deeply entwined. Here's your most daring move. You write. Not just commentaries or letters, but full philosophical treatises. One of them, now lost to time but still murmured about in footnotes, is an argument against Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor. Yes, you go after the big dogs, male philosophers with entire schools behind them. You call out their contradictions, you make their logic squirm, you use your brain like a stiletto, slipping it between their arguments until their entire premise bleeds. And they hate you for it, but that doesn't stop you. You keep writing even when men pretend not to read you. You keep showing up even when they claim you're only there to distract. You know the truth. The distractions they blame you for are their own. Now, scholars today can't agree on much about you. Some think you were just a hetaira with a talent for mimicry. Others believe you were the true intellectual force behind several early Epicurean texts, working in the shadows while male philosophers took the credit. A few insist your whole story is apocryphal, a convenient symbol cooked up later to either glorify or warn against women in philosophy. But the historical breadcrumbs persist. Diogenes Laertius, our favourite gossip in a toga, mentions you by name, which for a woman in that era is practically immortality. And then there's the deliciously obscure fringe fact. Fragments of a letter from a Roman Epicurean centuries later refer to the Lady of the Garden, Leontian, who dared to refute giants. You don't need a statue. You've got echoes. People assume your relationship with Epicurus was romantic. Maybe, maybe not. There's no hard evidence. But the assumption itself is telling. As if a woman can't sit at the table unless she's also under it. They can't imagine that he respected your mind more than your body. Or, worse, that he respected both equally. And what does it mean anyway? To be a courtesan in a school of pleasure. You're not peddling desire, you're dissecting it. Epicureanism isn't about hedonism, despite what the Stoics say. It's about intelligent pleasure. The pleasure of understanding, of deep conversation, of sensuality without guilt. You live that philosophy in every movement, every line of your writing. One afternoon, as cicadas hum in the trees and the sky glows white with heat, you sit with a student, a boy, barely of age, cheeks still soft with youth. He asks you what it means to be a woman in philosophy. You pause, then reply, "It means I must think twice as sharply to be heard half as often." He doesn't get it, but one day he might. Years pass, your name begins to fade from the syllabi. The garden survives, but becomes more reserved. Later Epicureans write less about female thinkers, more about moderation. A caution sets in. The world turns colder to the idea of a woman challenging the likes of Theophrastus or Zeno. But you don't vanish. Not really. In the back corners of university libraries, in dense footnotes and dusty scroll catalogues, your name flickers. Leontian, the courtesan who debated philosophers, the woman who dared to wield desire and dialectic in the same sentence. You may not be widely quoted, but you are known to those looking closely. And tonight, as the stars begin to bloom above the garden, you sit with a scroll across your knees, composing a new argument. Maybe it's about ethics, maybe about pleasure, maybe about the hypocrisy of men who demand purity from the very women they seek to corrupt. Whatever it is, it's razor sharp. Because in your world, philosophy isn't just something you study, it's something you live. On your own terms, with your own voice, and whether they call you courtesan or scholar, they still have to call you. Florence hums beneath a veil of candlelight and ink, perfumed with rosewater and the iron tang of freshly cleaned blades. You walk through its narrow cobbled alleys with the quiet grace of someone who knows she's being watched, and has no intention of hurrying. In this world of Medci princes, dueling poets, and churches that practically drip with gold, you are Tullia d'Aragona, half courtesan, half philosopher, and completely uninterested, in apologizing for either. Born illegitimate, possibly the daughter of a Spanish nobleman and a Roman courtesan, possibly not. You're wrapped in myth before you even learn to write. Your mother is said to be a famous beauty, and your own appearance, from a young age, attracts the kind of attention that feels like both flattery and danger. You learn quickly to use your words the way other girls are taught to use their eyes. You learn Latin, philosophy, music, and more importantly, you learn how to make men want to listen. By the time you're 15, your reputation is already outpacing you. You're beautiful, yes, but what unnerves the Florentine elite is your mind. You host salons filled with men twice your age, ambassadors, bishops, poets, even cardinals. They arrive thinking you'll entertain them with lute music and veiled innuendo. Instead, you engage in heated debates about free will, the soul and the nature of love. You quote Aristotle, then immediately argue with him. You recite Petrarch's verses, then shred his metaphors with surgical precision. The Medici court can't quite figure you out. Are you a temptress in pearls or a philosopher in disguise? You wear both masks depending on the evening. You take lovers, of course, but on your own terms. Your most famous liaison is with poet Girolamo Muzio, who writes you sonnets like a lovesick schoolboy. You accept them graciously. Then, in a letter he never expected you to publish, you critique his form, suggest he improve his metaphors, and sign off with a kiss and a flourish. It's one of the most elegant power plays in literary history. But your greatest triumph isn't in a bedroom or a salon, it's in ink. In 1547 you published Dialogues on the Infinity of Love, a bold philosophical treatise written in the form of a Platonic dialogue. In it, your avatar, Tullia, engages in deep metaphysical conversation with a male philosopher named Guglielmo. They discuss whether women are capable of rational intellectual love. Guglielmo argues, predictably, that they are not. You, through Tullia, argue otherwise, with elegance, clarity, and devastating logic. The book is a sensation. This is Renaissance Italy. Women aren't even allowed to attend university, and yet here you are, not only participating in philosophical discourse, but redefining it. You write of love not as some passive virtue bestowed upon women by men, but as something women can feel and choose, not just with their bodies, but with their minds. You argue that intellect and desire are not opposites, but necessary partners, that to be a woman who thinks is not to forfeit pleasure, but to deepen it. Scholars argue over whether your dialogues is truly philosophical or merely a clever literary flirtation. Some call it philosophy dressed in lace. Others, more recently, have begun to recognize it as one of the earliest feminist texts in European history, certainly one of the most audacious. And here's a wonderfully strange footnote. Your work circulates in aristocratic and ecclesiastical circles despite its radical content. Why? Because you know how to write for them. You make your arguments feel like banquets, rich, indulgent, impossible to refuse. You embed your rebellion in the rhythms of their favourite dialogues. You hide your subversion in beauty like a blade in a velvet case. But life is never just salons and scrolls. You face constant legal battles, accusations of immorality, threats from jealous husbands and pious moralists. You have to petition the city of Rome for permission to live independently, using your status as a courtigiana honesta, an honest courtesan, as justification. The phrase itself is a contradiction, and that's the point. You force them to admit that a woman can be sexually autonomous and intellectually formidable. That virtue isn't just for the married or the meek. There's an ongoing debate in literary circles about whether your dialogues reflect your true beliefs or were simply calculated to maintain patronage. But the answer is obvious to anyone who's read your letters. You believed in reason, you believed in pleasure, and you believed that women should be allowed both. Your story doesn't end with quiet retirement. You never fade into obscurity. Instead, you continue writing, debating, travelling until illness finally quiets your voice, but not your legacy. Centuries later, feminist scholars dig through dusty archives and pull out your name like a secret code. They translate your dialogues and find arguments that still sting with clarity. They see in you a woman centuries ahead of her time, refusing to split herself into acceptable halves. You were never just a courtesan, never just a philosopher. You were both, completely and unapologetically, and in doing so you carved a space where intellect and sensuality could not only coexist, but strengthen each other. Tonight, as Florence sleeps under its Renaissance sky, you sit at your desk, candlelight flickering across your ink-stained fingers. You're drafting a new letter, perhaps to another poet, perhaps to a new lover, perhaps to the future itself. And on the page, as always, you're brilliant. Bold, complicated, exactly as you were meant to be. The night smells like plum blossoms and old secrets, and you're gliding through the lacquered corridors of the Heian imperial court, feet gallant on polished wood, sleeves trailing like waves behind you. Your name is Kogyoku, once a consort, then an empress, and now something far more elusive, a woman who has ruled, been deposed and returned, all within the rigid beauty of Japan's most refined, most repressed age. You're draped in 12 layers of silk, your face powdered like porcelain, your every movement scripted by court protocol, and still, somehow you remain entirely yourself. This is the Heian period, a world where power hides behind poetry, where affairs of state are settled through handwritten notes tucked into fans, and where women, particularly women of the palace, wield influence not with proclamations, but with precision. You don't shout, you compose, you don't command, you imply, and no one does it more masterfully than you. You were born into nobility, of course. Everyone here is, but not everyone survives its machinery. Your first role is that of a consort, chosen not only for your lineage but for your intelligence, sharpened behind your polite smiles and perfect posture. When Emperor Jomei dies, you ascend, not just as his widow, but as Empress Regnant, taking the throne in your own name. You become Kogyoku, a rare thing. A woman emperor in a world built to keep women just off stage, whispering to the actors but never stepping into the spotlight. Your rule is controversial, not for any mistake you make, but because it happens at all. Men grumble behind fans, ministers hold emergency meetings, the Fujiwara clan, ever hungry for control, starts plotting how to gently push you back into the shadows. You see it coming, of course you do, so you do something no one expects. You abdicate, gracefully, strategically. They think they've won, they haven't. You retreat, wait, watch the power struggle unfold like an ugly poem. You let your brother ascend, knowing he's a placeholder. And when the time is right, when court tensions boil over and political winds shift, you return, you take the throne again, this time as Empress Saimei. Second reign, new name, like a poem with a twist ending. Now let's talk about what that really means. You're not a puppet. You're orchestrating delicate reforms, supporting military campaigns, managing court factions like a go board. You're particularly invested in diplomacy with Korea, overseeing military aid during the chaotic Three Kingdoms period. No, you're not a general swinging a sword, but your signature on the scroll moves armies. And in Heian, Japan, that's rarer than any battlefield triumph. The scholars argue about your role. Was it ceremonial? Symbolic? Did the real decisions come from male regents? Maybe some of them, but here's the thing. Symbolism is power in this world. A single word from your lips changes reputations. A carefully chosen poem can shape imperial perception for generations, and you understood that. You spoke with layered meaning, you elevated loyalists and quietly exiled threats, without ever raising your voice. But of course, power comes with rumours. Some say you kept lovers, young poets who served as both inspiration and entertainment. That your court was a maze of perfume and pillow talk, of midnight readings and secret assignations. Maybe so. In Heian court life, courtesans aren't prostitutes. They're literati. They're women who master poetry, calligraphy, court gossip and erotic suggestion. The pillow books of the time, especially the pillow book by Sei Shonagon, capture this strange blend of wit, sensuality, and administrative observation. It's a world where a woman's handwritten poem is more seductive than her touch, and you, Kogyoku, are fluent in that language. Here's the weird fringe fact. During your reign, there are mentions in the imperial chronicles of you receiving dreams, visions that guide political decisions. Some scholars argue this was a tactic. You knew men wouldn't take orders from a woman, so you gave them oracles instead. You turned intuition into strategy, spiritual authority into statecraft. Smart move. And what about the poetry? You composed it. Of course, all noble women did, but yours was sharp, precise, often melancholic. One fragment attributed to you reads, "The moonlight weeps on lacquered eaves. Will they remember a ruler with powdered cheeks and ink-stained hands?" That's the voice of a woman who knows she will be forgotten by design, and writes anyway. Eventually you abdicate again, this time for good. You leave the throne not in disgrace, but in control. You've outmaneuvered the men, steered the court through political storms, and left the imperial family stable. You die peacefully, but your legend lingers in the folds of court robes and the margins of dusty scrolls. Later historians try to downplay you. They say your reigns were brief, transitional. They call you a placeholder, a stopgap between real rulers. But the closer they look, the more they find your fingerprints in foreign policy, religious patronage, and the very aesthetics of the imperial court. And here's the irony. In a society that taught women to influence behind screens, you were both the shadow and the spotlight. You didn't need a general's armour. You had poetry, ink, silence, and that was enough. So tonight, as the moon washes over the silent palace gardens, your name curls through the air like incense. Kogyoku, Saimei, ruler, writer, whisperer of empires, and somewhere a court scribe dips his brush in ink and records your passing with proper formality, never suspecting that the woman he's writing about wasn't just a figurehead. She was the one holding the fan, and behind that fan she smiled and rewrote the ending. Silk rustles like leaves in a breeze as you move through the harem, no footsteps, no fanfare, just the faint jingle of golden anklets and the whisper of secrets pressed between painted lips. You're not in Greece or Rome or even ancient China anymore. You're in 19th century Qajar Persia, in the velvet depths of the royal court, where power smells like rosewater and opium, and where women behind lattice screens are far more dangerous than the men who sign decrees. You're one of them now, a courtesan. Technically, but here the word means something altogether different. Here the harem is an empire within an empire, and you, tucked within it, are a minister of gossip, poetry and espionage. Outside, the world sees a harem as a cage, an exoticized prison of idle women lounging on cushions and sipping sherbet. But from the inside, it's a thriving network of influence, coded language, and tactical relationships. No one rises alone. You're born into this life or bought into it. But survival comes only if you learn to navigate the silk maze with sharp wit and sharper alliances. You're educated. Don't let the veils fool anyone. You recite Rumi and Hafez from memory, write poems in your spare time, and send them folded inside delicate embroidery to favoured court officials. Your handwriting is perfect. Your metaphors are lethal. There are hundreds of women in the Shah's harem, some wives, some concubines, some servants, and all of them want something. Security, status, maybe just a name remembered when the next palace reshuffling comes. You want more than survival. You want to shape what happens beyond these jeweled doors, and so you begin to whisper. At first it's minor, a comment here, a well-placed accidental note there. But soon, you're passing poems that function like coded messages. One verse might predict a minister's downfall, another hints at a coming marriage alliance. The men think it's harmless flirting. They don't realize your couplets are forecasts, not fantasies. This is the Persian harem's real function. It's less about flesh and more about flow, the flow of information, power, gifts, favors. You trade secrets like silk. You build quiet coalitions with other women, forming a kind of parallel bureaucracy. Some women seduce, some charm. You compose. Your lines spread across the palace faster than any soldier can march. One day, a poem you write reaches the Shah himself. He's intrigued. You're summoned, not as a consort, not yet, but as a curiosity. You arrive veiled, eyes lowered, heart steeled. He asks who wrote the lines. You don't lie. I did, my Shah, you say softly. He pauses, smiles. You're not dragged away. You're invited back. Soon you're appearing in more private gatherings. You play music, you recite new verses. The ministers take notice, and some begin to fear you. Because if you can turn a phrase into prophecy, what else might you be capable of? Here's a historical footnote to anchor this world. The Qajar harem, especially under rulers like Fath Ali Shah and Nasr al-Din Shah, was not just a space of sexual politics but a cultural institution. Women within it, many highly educated, hosted literary salons, commissioned architectural works, and even influenced foreign policy through their access to royal ears. One of the Shah's consorts, Jiran, famously influenced military appointments. Others shaped the education of princes. The idea that the harem was passive is, frankly, laughable. But you are no Jairan. You're not at the centre of court life. You're at its edges, where rumour flows faster than official decree, and in many ways you prefer it. Because from the margins you can see everything. You learn the patterns, you read the facial tics of guards, the tone shifts of concubines who've been favoured too long. And here's a strange little detail. Some Persian poetry from the period references the woman of the lattice, an anonymous figure who appears in multiple verses across decades, sometimes warning, sometimes seducing, always observing. Scholars still debate if she was real or symbolic. You smile when you read this, because you know who she was. She was all of you, and none of you. A veil made of metaphor, a face glimpsed only in candlelight. Of course danger walks hand in hand with power. One misstep, one rumour about the wrong person, and you're out, exiled, married off to a minor noble, or worse, simply erased. You never forget that. Every line you write, every glance you allow is calculated. You wrap your insight in sweetness, your criticism in rhyme. No one can punish you for a verse they interpret incorrectly, or so you hope. But not all your work is about strategy. Some nights, when the harem is quiet and the only sound is the breeze teasing the drapes, you write just for yourself. Long, aching poems about longing, about identity, about the strange loneliness of being almost powerful. You hide these under your mattress. You know they can never be read. They are too raw, too real, yet one survives. It's found a century later, pressed between the pages of a forgotten book in a Tehran library. The script is elegant. The metaphors are deceptively simple. It ends with a line, what they call sons, I call orchestration. The author is unknown, but historians, at least the smart ones, know exactly where it came from. You don't live forever, you vanish, as many women in the harem eventually do, into the folds of domesticity or the finality of death. But your words echo, and the networks you built, the alliances you nurtured, the poetic insurgency you led from within, layers of gauze and etiquette, they remain. So tonight, as the oil lamps flicker against walls painted with birds and blossoms, you dip your pen once more into the inkwell. You write not for fame or legacy, but because this is how you breathe. And because even behind the veil, even behind the locked doors of the Qajar court, you have carved out a world entirely your own. The scent of roasted olives and lamp oil drifts through the warm Aegean air as you recline against a cushion on the polished floor of a symposium, watching men circle each other with arguments and wine cups. It's Athens again, but not the official one, not the marble and citizen Athens. This is the version tucked into private rooms, shadowed alcoves and terraces, where the real politics happen, under the soft candlelight of influence. And in this world, you're not just a guest, you're essential. You're one of the hetaira, the elite courtesans of Greece, and tonight, you run the room without ever standing up. The hetairae are not simple companions. You're trained, brilliant, and terrifying in your own way. Most women in Athens can't own property, speak in public, or attend these gatherings. But you're here because you're educated. Because you can quote Sappho as easily as Solon. Because you understand that your true currency is conversation, not just beauty. You sip watered wine and listen as a general tries to explain the latest skirmish in Thrace. He's loud, puffed up with self-importance, and, if you're being honest, boring. So you interrupt, gently, with a question that's both brilliant and completely disarming. He pauses, recalculates, tries to recover. The others laugh. You've turned the tide of the evening with a sentence. That's what hetairae do. You live in the in-between, between wife and mistress, citizen and outsider, entertainer and political operator. You're paid, yes, but not just for sex. You're paid for your presence, your influence, your ability to make men feel clever, desired, and crucially advised. In a city where reputation is everything, your whispers carry weight. You remember your training. How from girlhood you were taught not just to walk beautifully, but to read, to anticipate. You learned music, poetry, philosophy. You watched women like Aspasia hold salons that bent the will of statesmen. You learned to be noticed, but not too quickly, to speak last, but with something unforgettable. You learned that knowledge was not only power, it was protection. You're part of a social web that few citizens ever fully understand. The hetairae have their own hierarchies, their own rivalries and alliances. There's the one who knows how to influence generals, the one who seduces artists and has half the sculptors of the city in her debt, the one who writes letters for foreign kings and brokers marriages from behind a curtain. And then there's you, the quiet one with the dangerous memory, because you remember everything. Who said what after too much wine? Who let slip a planned vote, a trade route, a betrayal? You store these fragments like treasure or ammunition, not to blackmail, no, that's too crass, but to wield in small strategic moments. You once saved a politician's career by repeating a compliment he drunkenly gave about a rival's wife. You delivered it just loudly enough for the right ears to hear. He thanked you with a vineyard deed. You haven't paid for wine in months. Now, to be clear, not all hetairae are so elevated. Some remain tethered to the whims of their clients, trapped by debt or misjudged ambition. But you've worked too hard to let that happen. You've refused more men than you've accepted, and your refusal is its own kind of performance. It elevates you, turns you into a prize, but there's always risk. You know the story of Neaira, a hetaira who tried to pass herself off as a citizen's wife and ended up on trial, her life picked apart in court by men who had once bought her favours. There's a lesson there. Never let them forget what you are, but never let them define it either. And here's the scholarly debate. Were hetairae truly empowered, or just gilded captives in a patriarchal structure? Did you control the conversation, or were you only allowed to speak because men found it entertaining? Maybe both. Maybe that's the cruel beauty of it. But let's not pretend you weren't strategic. You built a life that few women could imagine. You travelled. You owned property. You wrote letters that were read in city-states across the Aegean. You turned your home into a school of sorts, mentoring younger hetairae in how to survive, how to listen, how to speak, how to know. There's a fringe theory that the hetairae were the true authors of certain philosophical texts. Scribes and thinkers who contributed to Socratic dialogues and then disappeared beneath male names. It's unproven, of course, but it wouldn't surprise you. Not after what you've seen. Because tonight, as the symposium winds down and the men drift into drunken song, you stay sharp. You've caught 3 pieces of useful gossip, identified a new political alliance forming between 2 unlikely magistrates, and made a senator's son fall in love with you by quoting Pindar from memory. He'll write you letters for weeks, you'll never answer them. You retire to your quarters with the windows open to the stars, your sandals kicked off, your head spinning not from wine, but from calculation. This city pretends you don't exist during the daylight, but at night you hold its leash, because Athens isn't run by who speaks the loudest, it's run by who listens best. And in that art, you are the master. The candle burns low and the ink smudges slightly beneath your fingers, but you don't stop writing. Not yet, not until this verse is finished, every syllable tight and trembling with unspoken defiance. You're deep in the Spanish viceroyalty of New Spain, now called Mexico, surrounded by convent walls and cloistered silence, but within you, a fire burns. You are Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a nun, a writer, a scholar, a courtesan not of the flesh but of the intellect, enticing minds instead of bodies, seducing entire societies with nothing more than poetry, wit, and unrelenting intellect. You were born illegitimate in 17th century Mexico, in a world that expected women to be quiet, humble, and wholly disinterested in books. You were interested in only books. At 3, you taught yourself to read. At 8, you wrote your first poem. By your teens, you were composing plays, delivering philosophical arguments, and memorizing entire Latin texts just to prove that you could. Your beauty opened doors briefly, an invitation to court as a lady-in-waiting. But even then, your real appeal was your mind. The Spanish viceroy's court adored you. You became its shining ornament, dazzling nobles with riddles, writing love poems that made bishops blush, and solving philosophical conundrums like other girls wove lace. But the court had limits. It wanted you tame, married, or at least married off. You refused. So you joined a convent. Not out of piety, though you could recite theology with the best of them, but because it was the only place a woman could live unmarried, study freely, and remain economically independent. You chose the veil the way another woman might choose armour. And inside those convent walls, you built an empire of thought. Your cell becomes a sanctuary of books, instruments, globes, and correspondence. You study music, math, philosophy, physics, law, and theology. You write poetry that slices through gender norms and exposes hypocrisy like a stiletto. You craft plays performed across Mexico and Spain, some of them so rich with double entendre that they make even experienced courtiers squirm. You flirt with the boundary between sacred and profane until it's unclear where prayer ends and poetry begins. And at the centre of it all? Your relationship with the Countess of Paredes, your patron, your muse, your possible lover. You write to her with breathless intimacy, letters so drenched in affection and yearning that later scholars will either sanitize them or salivate over them, depending on their agenda. One line from your verses to the Countess reads, "That you may love me as I love you would make you love me twice." Was it romantic, erotic, platonic? You don't explain. You never explain. You leave the interpretation like a trap for future historians to fall into, and fall they do. Some claim you were merely affectionate. Others insist you were a secret revolutionary, writing lesbian love poetry under the nose of the church. Still others argue that your devotion to the Countess was spiritual, is exalted. You allow all of these theories to coexist. Why should your mind be simpler than your society? But your brilliance has consequences. You attract enemies, jealous theologians, insecure priests, and eventually the Archbishop of Mexico himself, who encourages a fellow nun to publicly criticize your work. Your response, the now famous Respuesta a Sor Filotea, is a masterpiece of rhetorical self-defense. You politely dismantle her arguments, assert the right of women to intellectual life, and cite every female scholar and saint you can name like a polite dagger to the ribs. You sign it humbly, obediently, but the subtext roars. Still, the tide turns, the church tightens its grip, your supporters fade. The Countess leaves Mexico. The intellectual freedom you fought for begins to crumble under pressure. You're ordered to stop writing secular works. You sell your vast library to fund aid for the poor. You sign a confession. Some say you do it out of fear. Others believe it's strategy. Another performance, perhaps. One last mask. A year later, you die while tending to sick nuns during an epidemic. Not from censorship, not from heartbreak, from service, quiet, undramatic, holy in its own way. But you don't vanish. Your works survive, in Spain, in secret, in whispers. Centuries later, feminists rediscover your texts and declare you the first great feminist voice of the Americas. Queer scholars comb your verses for hidden truths. Latin American intellectuals lift you up as a national icon, a literary saint. Mexico eventually puts your face on its currency, and yet even now the debate continues. Were you radical or careful? A closeted lover or a platonic devotee? A rebel in disguise, or a woman simply too brilliant to be contained? You would have laughed at all of it, because you knew what most people didn't. That influence doesn't always come from seduction or scandal. Sometimes it comes from refusal, from holding your ground in silence while the world shouts, from writing in the dark and letting your words find their way centuries later into the light. Tonight, in your small cell, walls lined with parchment and stars visible through the narrow window, you light another candle. You pick up your quill, and you write, as always, not to be understood, but to be unforgettable. The marble halls of Constantinople are quieter than usual. Beyond the thick velveted drapes and polished columns, the city breathes nervously, waiting. A general has revolted. The people are restless. Riots flicker like torches in the corners of the empire. But you sit beside the emperor on a gilded throne, spine straight, eyes harder than the sapphire at your throat. You are Theodora, once an actress, a courtesan, a punchline. Now, Empress of Byzantium. And no one is laughing anymore. They don't talk about your early years in polite company. Not openly. You were born in the underbelly of the hippodrome, daughter of a bear trainer, yes, really, where cheers and jeers rang louder than prayers. You performed on Stay by your teens, pantomiming obscene comedies in very little clothing and earning coins with every seductive gesture. You were clever even then, sharp-tongued and impossible to ignore. You weren't just there to dance, you were memorized, you travelled, you suffered, you fell into the arms of wealthy men and out again. You were not pampered. You were used, discarded, exiled, passed around like a coin whose edges had worn smooth. And then one day you vanished from the stage. Years later you reappeared in Alexandria, no longer draped in glittering scandal, but in spiritual resolve. You said you'd found God. The elite rolled their eyes. And then came Justinian. The man who would become emperor met you and forgot himself. He was captivated, not just by your beauty, but by your mind, your defiance, your bite. You didn't flatter him, you challenged him. You didn't behave, you negotiated. When he proposed marriage, the court was horrified. Marry a courtesan, a former actress, an ex-pantomime. It was scandalous enough that laws had to be rewritten just to make it possible. But Justinian did it anyway. And you walked into the palace not as a guest, but as a ruler. You didn't waste time. You pushed for laws to protect women from forced prostitution. You expanded divorce rights. You cracked down on brothel pimps who mistreated girls. You gave women a legal presence, something they hadn't had in centuries. You built refuges for former sex workers, places where women like you could live without shame or starvation. You didn't call it justice, you called it personal. But you weren't just a reformer. You were ruthless when you had to be, and you proved that during the Nika riots. The city erupted. Factions of chariot-racing fans turned into mobs, chanting for Justinian's head. He wanted to flee, so you told him no. In a speech that would be remembered for centuries, you said, calmly, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Translation? I'd rather die an empress than live as nothing. Your resolve shamed him into staying. You held the line. You ordered the palace gates barred. Justinian's generals crushed the rebellion. 30,000 people died. Your enemies fell subsequent. Your crown, once a novelty, was now cemented in blood. There's a debate, of course. Some historians claim your early life was exaggerated by your enemies, especially Pericles, the court historian whose secret history paints you as a depraved, demon-haunted manipulator. Others argue he was the only one willing to speak the truth, that you hid your ambition behind charitable works and pretty words. But even he, in spite of himself, couldn't deny your effectiveness. And here's a delicious fringe fact. You may have had a hand in theological debates that shaped Christian doctrine. You weren't a passive observer during the Monophysite controversies. You wrote letters, negotiated with bishops, and used your influence to protect exiled clergy. The woman who once mimed lewd jokes on stage was now reinterpreting the nature of Christ. Try wrapping your head around that. You and Justinian ruled as equals. That's not hyperbole. When he was away on campaigns, you presided over councils. Your name appeared in laws. Your seal-stamped official correspondence. People bowed to you. Or else. And when you died, too young, possibly of cancer, Justinian wept. He ruled for years afterward, but his edge dulled. He became a shadow of the man you sharpened. The city mourned you in 1,000 silent ways. Extra candles in churches, women whispering your name behind veils. Girls dreaming of something more than marriage. Centuries later, you are canonized by the Eastern Orthodox Church. Saint Theodora, Empress, redeemed sinner. defender of women. Still, others remember you not for piety, but for that unwavering stare during the riot, for the way your presence silenced a court built entirely by men. You didn't erase your past, you used it. You walked into the palace carrying every scar, every insult, every whispered joke, and turned it all into policy, into action, into legend. So tonight, in the Hagia Sophia that you helped construct, where incense still coils around columns you approved, a flicker of you lingers in the candlelight. You, the courtesan who became an empress, the empress who became a saint. They wrote about you with venom, they wrote about you with awe, but above all, they wrote, because you made it impossible not to. The air is thick with the scent of rosewater and politics. Behind the ornate doors of the Topkapi Palace, past marble courtyards and beneath ceilings carved with gold leaf and whispers, you move like a question no one dares to ask out loud. You are Nakshadil Sultan, or at least that's the name the court has given you. The girl who may have once been Aimée du Bouc de Riverie, a French aristocrat abducted by corsairs, vanished from the salons of Martinique or Paris and re-emerged, impossibly, as the consort of an Ottoman sultan. Maybe. The historians can't quite agree, and frankly you prefer it that way, because what matters isn't where you came from, it's where you landed. You're deep in the 18th century Ottoman Empire, an empire bloated and brilliant, fraying at the edges but still dazzling at the centre. The harem, contrary to every Western fantasy ever inked onto paper, is not just a pleasure palace. It's a labyrinthine court of its own, a university of power, where girls are taught more than beauty. They're trained in diplomacy, history, and quiet manipulation. And you master it faster than anyone expected. Some say you arrived speaking only French, confused and terrified. Others insist you are no helpless damsel but a sharp-tongued girl who quickly learned Turkish, Arabic, and court etiquette with unnerving speed. Either way, by the time you're in your early 20s, you've risen to become a favoured consort of Sultan Abdulhamid I. When your son is born, Mahmud, you don't just become a mother, you become the mother, the Valida Sultan in waiting. You watch the court with precise detachment. Eunuchs whisper, viziers smile too much. Wives play innocent while plotting favours. You nod politely and remember everything. You understand that true influence in the Ottoman palace isn't in shouting, it's in staying quiet long enough that people start listening harder. And then your moment comes. Abdulhamid dies, and while your son is still a child, he's seen as a possible heir. Eventually he becomes Sultan, and just like that, you are Valida Sultan, the mother of the ruler, which means you now wield the most powerful position available to a woman in the empire. You don't sit on a throne, but your hand is in every decision that matters. Here's where things get clever. You use your French heritage, not as baggage, but as leverage. You encourage Western-style reforms in the palace, introducing European medicine, architecture, and educational practices. You support Mahmud's interest in modernization, helping him reform the military and abolish the Janissary Corps, a power move so dangerous it could have ended his reign, or yours. But instead, it solidifies it. Did you ever truly come from France? No one's quite sure. The story goes that you were a cousin of Josephine, wife of Napoleon, kidnapped by Algerian pirates and presented as a gift to the Ottoman court. Romantic? Absolutely. Verifiable? Not in the slightest. But the rumour sticks, and suddenly you're not just a mother of a sultan, you're a symbol of East meeting West, of silk-wrapped diplomacy, of survival packaged in beauty, and that ambiguity becomes your greatest tool. You're not just a courtesan, not just a mother, not just a political operator, you're a legend in real time, and legends are harder to kill. Of course, though, there are whispers that you favoured French envoys in negotiations, that you smuggled Christian rites into the palace under the guise of private rituals, that you had too much power over your son. Some even accuse you of trying to turn the Ottoman court into a prison salon. You laugh privately as you sip your coffee and sign another letter to the British ambassador. Here's the historical twist. While the story of Nakshadil's French origins remains unverified, she did exist, and her son Mahmud II did carry out some of the most significant reforms in Ottoman history. Her influence, especially during his formative years, is widely acknowledged, even if the details are murky. She oversaw the education of her grandchildren, pushed for military modernization, and left behind a cultural shift that still echoes through Turkish history. And here's the fringe detail that scholars still fight about. When Nakshadil died, she was buried not just with Ottoman rites, but with several un-Islamic features in her tomb, elements some interpret as Christian. Was it nostalgia, secret identity, a posthumous compromise between the cultures she bridged? You don't answer. You never did. Because you understood something no man in the court ever fully grasped. Clarity is overrated. Let them wonder. Let them argue. Meanwhile, you build, you establish hospitals. You commission French-style architecture in Istanbul. You teach the women of the harem to read, to think, to govern behind their veils. You become a myth mothers whisper to their daughters when they dream of more than embroidery and silence. So tonight, as the Bosphorus glimmers under the moon and the palace grows quiet, your presence still lingers in the courtyards. The air smells like jasmine and old paper. Your papers, your plans, your poetry. Yes, you wrote poetry too, in both Turkish and French. Because why not? You went from the shores of Martinique, or maybe you didn't, to the heart of an empire. You passed through captivity, or maybe privilege, into power. You weren't a princess by blood, but you became one by force of will. And somewhere in the golden seance of your old chambers, a new girl with bright eyes and sharper ambitions reads about you. She traces your name on a silk cushion and wonders what she could become. You taught her that she could be anything, as long as she never lets them know exactly what. The city of Vijayanagara rises out of red earth and blinding sunlight, its towers and gopurams shimmering with carvings of gods, dancers, and demons caught mid-step. Stone markets line the streets, elephants sway under silk canopies, and temple bells echo like slow heartbeats. This is South India in its golden age, 15th century give or take. And beneath all the colour, all the grandeur, something else pulses. Language. Art, seduction, influence, and you seated under the shade of a frangipani tree are right at the centre of it. A courtesan of Vijayanagara, a devadaisi, a royal companion, an artist, a diplomat in anklets. Forget the Western lens. Here a courtesan is not a shadow figure or a shameful secret. Here you're sacred. You're trained in Sanskrit and dance, in philosophy and erotics. You're linked not to a single man, but to a temple, a city, a god. Your body isn't for sale, it's for worship. You're both revered and feared, for you represent something most people will never master. Freedom that looks like submission. From childhood, you were chosen, maybe by caste, maybe by talent. You learned Apaineia, the language of the eyes, until a single glance could tell entire epics. You learned Bharatanatyam from a woman who once danced before the king himself. You studied Vedas and Kama Sutra in equal measure, understanding that pleasure and divinity are not enemies here, but siblings. The kings know who you are. They watch your performances from ivory balconies, clapping softly behind rings encrusted with rubies. They summon you, not just to entertain, but to listen, to advise. A whispered warning from you about a disloyal general has shifted more than one campaign. You speak rarely at court, but when you do, silence follows, and your words linger long after you leave. You live in a grand house just outside the temple complex, high ceilings, sandalwood doors, peacocks in the courtyard. You own land, servants, a small library of palm leaf manuscripts. You host poets and scholars, share verses over mango wine, and sometimes pen your own under a pseudonym known only to a few. Your writing is bold, sensual, packed with metaphor. People swear they can recognize your voice in anonymous poems that circulate between cities. There's a particular kind of fame here. Your name is painted in gold leaf on temple walls. Devotees leave garlands at your door. Young girls imitate your steps in the dirt. Some say you're the mistress of a prince. Others say you've never belonged to anyone but the god you dance for. Both versions are true in their way. And here's a historical twist. The devadaisi system, in its early centuries, was not exploitative but empowering. Courtesans like you wielded wealth and authority, received royal patronage, and contributed to politics through performance. You weren't a kept woman, you were a cultural institution, part priestess, part artist, part political whisperer. And for a time, your place in society was not questioned, it was celebrated. But not everyone understood. Traders from the north called you immoral. Portuguese merchants muttered into their goblets about dancing women with too much power. Some Brahmins grumbled about purity, forgetting that the gods themselves demand beauty and rhythm. You kept your chin high and danced harder. You remember one evening, a monsoon just beginning to drum against the stone tiles. The king's court was tense. War loomed on the edge of the Deccan. You were summoned not to distract, but to decide. A general had insulted the heir's wife, and a faction wanted him executed. You listened, quiet. Then you told a story, an old parable from the Mahabharata about pride, patience, and forgiveness disguised as revenge. The room went still. The general was spared. The heir looked at you like he'd just seen lightning. Your power didn't come from a sword. It came from knowing. Of course, time would turn, the centuries would blur the lines between devotion and servitude. Colonialism, reform movements, and Victorian morality would come crashing in like a flood. The British would look at your world through a grimy glass and declare you corrupt. They wouldn't see the poetry, they would see only sex. Your legacy would be split. Temples closed to Devadasis, laws passed in the name of rescue. Stories rewritten with shame where there was once art. But the carvings would remain, the songs, the stone steps worn smooth by your ancestors' bare feet, the rituals, the echoes, and the scholars, much later, would begin to dig. They'd find records of you, land deeds, donations to temples, royal court poems that mention your name in reverent tones. They'd argue, were you liberated or used, a priestess or a pawn? And the answer, as always, would be both and neither. Because your life was not designed for binary logic. Here's a fringe detail. Some of the earliest feminist Indian writers looked to women like you not with pity but with awe. You embodied a type of self-possession they dreamed of, your autonomy, your artistry, the way you moved through a male-dominated world without being erased by it. A radical figure wrapped in jasmine. Tonight, as the sun sinks behind the granite hills and the temple drums begin their rhythm, you step onto the platform. Your anklets chime. Your fingers press into a mudra that tells a story no one's heard quite this way before. The crowd leans forward, not just because you're beautiful, but because you're saying something dangerous, something holy, something true. And afterward, when the king offers you a jewel, you smile and thank him, but slip it into the temple's donation box. Not because you're pious, but because you know what really lasts. Not the gift, the gesture. The desert doesn't whisper. It sings. The wind glides over dunes like a bow across strings, low and constant, shaping the horizon into shifting waves of gold. Somewhere beyond those sands, in a place that shimmers with both legend and smoke, stands a fortress carved into the rock, half palace, half sanctuary. Inside, the scent of myrrh clings to the air, and somewhere behind an embroidered curtain, you're dictating a letter. To whom? Possibly a Roman general, possibly a Nabatean merchant prince, possibly both. You are Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra, and depending on who's telling the story, you're either the last great queen of the East, or a courtesan in a crown who dared to challenge an empire. Palmyra sits at the crossroads of the world, a caravan city of merchants, scholars, mercenaries, and dreamers. Gold, silk, and spices all pass through here. So do ideas, so do armies. Your people call you Bat Zabai, daughter of a noble line. You trace your ancestry quite deliberately to Cleopatra and Dido. You're a scholar of Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Egyptian. You can recite Homer as easily as you quote local epics. You're a queen who can command a cavalry and compose a treaty, sometimes in the same afternoon. When your husband, King Odaenathus, is assassinated under mysterious circumstances, and let's be honest, suspiciously convenient ones, you step into power not as a grieving widow but as regent for your young son. You dress in royal purple but carry a sword. You host philosophers and priests at your court and dispatch emissaries across the eastern provinces. What you're really doing? Building. Palmyra is still technically a Roman client state, but you understand the game. Rome is weak, it's distracted, Gaul is in flames, emperors rise and fall like leaves in a storm. And you, smiling beneath a veil of political formality, begin to move your pieces. You conquer Egypt. Yes, Egypt. With your general Zabdas, you sweep through Alexandria, claiming it not with reckless force, but with precision and speed. Then you take large swathes of Asia Minor, Arabia, and parts of Anatolia. Rome, still busy chewing its own limbs off, barely reacts, until they finally blink and realize you've created a shadow empire. One ruled not by a Roman patrician, but by a Syrian woman. This is where the historians begin to disagree. Was it ambition? Did you intend to declare independence all along? Or were you simply protecting your region from the chaos of a crumbling Rome? Some say you styled yourself as empress. Others claim you never wanted war. Still others believe you were pushed into it by power-hungry generals. But let's not kid ourselves. You were never pushed anywhere. You chose. Here's a fringe fact they don't teach in school. Coins minted during your reign show you wearing a diadem and imperial robes, alongside your son Vaballathus. Your titles include Augusta, and in some inscriptions, you're presented not as regent but as co-ruler. Symbolic? Maybe, but coins don't lie. They circulate. They speak. And across the east, they said, Palmyra has a queen. Of course, Rome couldn't let that stand. Emperor Aurelian, who wasn't known for subtlety, marched east with a vengeance. And still, you didn't flinch. You met him in battle, leading your armies on horseback, veiled against the sun, commanding soldiers who believed in you not just as a monarch, but as a symbol. Aurelian defeats you eventually. Of course he does. Rome doesn't lose forever. But the campaign is brutal, and your resistance forces the empire to treat you not like a rebel, but like a rival. They capture you outside the gates of Palmyra. And then the narrative splits. Some sources say you were paraded through Rome in golden chains, humiliated in a triumphal procession. Others say you charmed Aurelian so completely that he spared you, gave you a villa near Tivoli, and let you live out your days in comfort. There's even a romantic version, that you married a Roman senator, hosted salons, and lived into your 80s, tutoring noble girls in Greek philosophy and how to carry a dagger in their smile. Was any of it true? Possibly all, possibly none. But here's what matters. You were never erased. You don't disappear into a footnote. You don't become a cautionary tale or a nameless queen lost to time. You remain a figure of obsession, admired, maligned, mythologized. Gibbon calls you the most illustrious of all women in Roman history. Edwardian writers compare you to Boudica, Cleopatra, even Joan of Arc. And every few years a new novel or opera resurrects you, always unsure whether to crown you or condemn you. Your legacy becomes even more fascinating when viewed through the lens of gender. You didn't seduce your way into power. You didn't marry upward. You commanded. You strategized. You conquered. And yet later chroniclers, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman outplaying an empire, try to explain you away. Some call you manly. Others insist you were merely a puppet of male generals. Some claim your downfall came because you overreached, as if a man would have been warned not to get ideas above his station, but you wore those ideas like armor. Tonight, in the ruins of Palmyra, the moonlight still catches the edges of broken columns. Tourists walk past fallen walls, snapping photos, unaware that they're standing in the remains of a city once ruled by a woman who refused to bow. Somewhere beneath the sand, your coin still sleeps, your profile in silver, gaze unyielding. Let them argue over who you were. You knew the truth. You were a queen who rode like a general, ruled like an emperor, and lived like a legend. And you never needed anyone's permission. The moonlight touches Cairo like a secret. From the rooftops, the call to prayer echoes across a city layered in time. Fatimid arches, Mamluk minarets, Ottoman balconies all stitched together like an embroidered veil. Beneath it all, the streets pulse with the scent of cinnamon, oud, and fresh bread. And somewhere just off the main bazaar, in a house with coloured glass windows and a courtyard full of fig trees, you stand before a mirror, fastening earrings heavy with gold. You are Shajarat al-Durr, Queen of Egypt, Sultana of Strategy, and you didn't come this far to play second to anyone, not a sultan, not a caliph, and certainly not history. Your name means tree of pearls, but don't let that softness fool anyone. You weren't born royal. Some say you were Armenian. Others claim Turkic origins. Either way, you arrived in Egypt as a slave in the harem of Sultan Salih Ayyub. But you didn't stay hidden behind a screen. You were educated, observant, and deadly good at recognizing when power was shifting and how to step right into the space it left behind. You rose from concubine to wife, and not just in title. You were his partner, his confidant, his political equal. When he grew ill during the Crusader invasion, the Seventh Crusade, led by none other than Louis IX of France, you didn't just nurse him, you managed the war from behind his sickbed, issuing orders in his name while the men outside fumbled and whispered. And when he died mid-campaign, you made the most extraordinary decision of your life. You didn't tell anyone. Think about that. The Crusaders are at the gate. The Mamluk generals are barely holding the lines. The Sultan is dead, and you, alone, veiled, and technically powerless, keep the secret. For weeks, you sign his name on letters. You seal decrees with his insignia. You feed the illusion that Egypt still has a living sultan. Why? Because panic is a faster killer than any sword. Eventually, you break the news, on your own terms. By then the kingdom is still standing. You arrange for the Sultan's son to take the throne, but he's weak, young, unliked. You recognize what everyone else is trying to deny. The real power lies with the Mamluks, Egypt's elite slave soldiers. And you know them. You've worked with them. You've even earned their respect. So you make your next move. You become Sultana. Officially, openly. For a few brief blazing months, you rule Egypt in your own name. The first and only woman in Islamic history to do so with the full title of Sultan. Your image is stamped on coins, cloaked and crowned. You hold court, you negotiate with ambassadors, you oversee military actions. And the people, they don't revolt, they don't panic, many even cheer. But the caliph in Baghdad, who holds spiritual authority over much of the Muslim world, is scandalized. A woman on the throne? Absolutely not. He sends a furious letter demanding an explanation. And so you pivot again, handing off the title to a powerful Mamluk general Is al-Din Aibak, while remaining the power behind the throne. You marry him, strategically of course. You remain in control of state affairs while letting him play sultan in public. For a while it works, then he grows too ambitious. He begins maneuvering to sideline you, speaking of taking a second wife, an insult you will not tolerate. So you do what any ruthless political survivor might. You have him assassinated. Brutally. In your own palace. Rumours swirl that his body was thrown into the moat. Unfortunately, this time your calculation misfires. The Mamluks turn on you, not out of loyalty to Aibak, but because chaos is contagious. His teenage son leads a public revenge campaign. You're arrested, stripped of your titles and imprisoned in a tower. Your former guards now watch you like a threat. And when they come for you, they don't come with swords. They come with wooden clogs. It sounds absurd, but it's true. The execution method chosen for you, beating with sandals, was meant to humiliate. A once ruler, struck down not with regal ceremony, but with the same object used by bathhouse attendants. A punishment designed to degrade as much as destroy. You die in that tower. But not quietly, because even as you fall, your legacy rises. You are not erased. Your story persists in chronicles, poems, and, most symbolically, in architecture. The mausoleum of Shajarat al-Durr still stands in Cairo, its walls carved with the elegance you always carried. It's not just a tomb, it's a declaration. Modern historians still debate you. Were you a cunning manipulator or a visionary leader? A scheming widow or a woman who refused to sit quietly in the background of a kingdom she held together? Were you ruthless? Absolutely. But when the world gave you no power, you took it. And when they said you couldn't rule, you ruled anyway. Here's the strange fringe detail. Your brief reign created a political precedent. After your death, the Mamluks, once mere slaves, officially took power, founding their own sultanate. In a way, you didn't just rule, you unlocked the door for an entirely new regime, one that would dominate Egypt for centuries. So tonight, in the quiet heart of Cairo, a city still layered with empires and echoes, your name survives. The Tree of Pearls, the Sultana who wore no man's shadow, the woman who outwitted a crusade, a caliph, and an entire kingdom, if only for a moment, and sometimes that moment is all it takes to become eternal.